the motion, I call Maria Eagle.
I beg to move the motion standing in my name and that of my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, and other right honourable friends. Can I start by welcoming the honourable member for Wirral West, the Work and Pensions Minister, who's been put up to speak for the government in this debate. Despite ministers having repeatedly stressed that food banks are, and I quote, absolutely not part of our welfare system, it's regrettable that the department with lead responsibility for food in our country, DEFRA, has not felt it appropriate to provide a minister either to open or close this debate. Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, is there a more damning indictment of this government's record than the number of people now relying on food aid in this country? Already, since April this year, over 500,000 people have relied on assistance from the 400 food banks run by the Trussell Trust charity, double the number of food banks compared to this time last year. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm hugely grateful to the honourable lady for giving way. Could I ask her why it was her government that refused to allow job centres to give out food bank vouchers, and it's this government that changed it? And could I also...
Order!
Could I also mention to the honourable lady... They don't want to hear the truth, Madam Deputy Speaker. Why is it? Why?
Order! The honourable gentleman should make a brief intervention, but order! It will be heard by the House. So the honourable gentleman may make his intervention now and briefly.
Why is it that there has been a huge rise in Germany and France and across Europe in the number of food banks, and that actually in France 1 in 88 people are fed by food banks, and yet in the United Kingdom it's 1 in 181?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman asked me first of all why it was that the previous government did not refer people to food banks who needed assistance. In a parliamentary answer from September, his own government has made it clear that Job Centre Plus signpost people to food banks only, doesn't refer people to food banks or issue vouchers, so there's no difference there whatsoever. Can I make it clear, Madam Deputy Speaker? No. Can I make it clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I won't be taking many interventions because of the number? No. I am seeking to give honourable friends and honourable members on all sides of the House a chance to get into the debate, and it does not help if I take 3/4 of an hour to open the debate. I'll take 1 or 2 only.
That's Madam Deputy Speaker, as a fellow Knowsley MP, will my honourable friend agree with me that from April to November the 13th it's a disgrace that 756 children were referred to food banks with vouchers and 1,424 adults? While we congratulate the agencies involved in doing that work, isn't it absolutely disgraceful that this is what we're reduced to?
Honourable friend, and he and I do share food bank provision in both our constituencies, so I know that to be true. Madam Deputy Speaker, already since April this year, over 500,000 people have relied on assistance from the 400 food banks run by the Trussell Trust charity, double the number of food banks compared to this time last year. 500,000 people, Madam Deputy Speaker, and 1/3 of those are children. In Britain, the 7th richest country on the planet, in the 21st century. It's a scandal, and it's getting worse. More people going to food banks in the last 9 months than in the whole of the last year. 500,000 people, compared to 26,000 people before the last general election. I'll give way once more on either side to the right honourable gentleman.
I'm most grateful to the honourable lady for giving way. She seems to be placing responsibility for all this at the door of the coalition government. she aware that the excellent food bank in Farnborough was established in 2009 as the 49th Trussell Trust food bank, and that therefore it illustrates that it was the destruction of the public finances by her government which has been responsible for the disaster which has affected this country?
I agree, Madam Deputy Speaker, that some food banks were established before the last election. There are 400 established by the Trussell Trust now, rather than 49. By the time we left office, 40,000 people were visiting food banks, a tenfold increase over the 4,000 at the start. No. There are now 500,000 people. That is an exponentially larger figure. And it is correct that this House seeks to find out what the real cause of that increase is. It's a scandal, Madam Deputy Speaker, which is getting worse. And the government now has the humiliation of the Red Cross helping to collect and distribute food aid in Britain for the first time since the Second World War. While the rise of food... Once more on this side of the House, I
thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. I know she's under a lot of pressure. I wanted to inform her and the House that people aren't only depending on food banks, that poor people in Slough are now fighting each other in Tesco when the discount vegetables and fruits come out, so that the local Tesco is... My constituent texted me yesterday to say he had observed these fights on 3 separate occasions when the discount fruit and vegetables came out, and that Tesco is now having to put security on to deal with that. Isn't that a shocking sign in the 21st century?
Madam Deputy Speaker, that is a shocking fact. I hope honourable and right honourable members across the House will appreciate the fact that I wish to give the longest possible time for people to get in those experiences in this debate, and I won't be therefore taking further interventions. Whilst the rise of food banks is not something that anyone can be proud of, the huge volunteering effort going into keeping them going is something we should be very proud of. Communities coming together in outrage and in sorrow at the growing poverty and hardship they see around them, and whether organised by churches, voluntary organisations or individuals, people have refused to stand by and watch their neighbours go without food. Over 30,000 volunteers now giving their time, others donating over 3,400 tonnes of food last year. But the rise of reliance on food banks has angered people around the country. That's why we've seen more than 141,000 people sign the Mirror's petition demanding this debate. A debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the government could have held in their own parliamentary time, but chose not to. And let's be clear who is now relying on food aid in this country. While in the past it may well have been those who were homeless, or at least those without an income, that is increasingly not the case. In fact, just 4% of people turn to food banks due to homelessness. 19% of referrals to food banks have been as a result of the government's changes to welfare. More than a third were down to the incompetence that sees delays in payments to which people are legitimately entitled. But the majority of people turn... No, I've made clear I'm not giving way because I want to maximise the amount of time that others have to get into this well-oversubscribed debate. The majority of people turning to food banks are working-age families. Nearly a fifth are in work, but still struggling to get through the month. As Trussell Trust Executive Chairman Chris Mould says, and I quote, 2012 to 13 was much tougher for people than many anticipated. Incomes are being squeezed to breaking point. We're seeing people from all kinds of backgrounds turning to food banks. Working people coming in on their lunch breaks, mums who are going hungry to feed their children, people whose benefits have been delayed, and people who are struggling to find work. It's shocking that people are going hungry in the 21st century in Britain. He's right, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, the government has tried to claim that this growth in food banks is a case of supply and demand. Lord Freud, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary in the DWP, suggested in July that the rise was down to people seeking out food because it was free, saying, and I quote, "By definition, there's an almost infinite demand for a free good. Yet everyone who receives food from a food bank is referred by a frontline organisation and therefore verified as being in a crisis situation." No. To suggest people can just arrive asking for free food shows how out of touch ministers are with the way that they work. The Trussell Trust...
I can't hear the minister. And the minister's speaking, I'm your shadow minister, and she is speaking perfectly clearly. There's too much noise in the chamber. Members should have the courtesy to listen to the lady who is proposing the motion. Maria Eagle.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe the Honourable Lady may have inadvertently misled the House in that saying that benefit delay was rising when it is actually falling by 6%.
No. The Honourable Gentleman knows that is a matter for debate, and I have no doubt he will be able to put that point later in the debate. The more time we spend on points of order and on me quietening people down, the less time there will be for members to make the points they wish to make. Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. To suggest that people can just arrive at a food bank asking for free food shows just how out of touch ministers are with the way in which food banks work. The Trussell Trust is very clear. Over 50% of referral agents are statutory agencies, and referrers include doctors, social workers, school liaison officers and Citizens Advice Bureau advisors. These professionals make sure that people turning to food banks are in genuine crisis. Madam Deputy Speaker, people are not using food banks out of choice, but out of necessity. But ministers still refuse to listen. The Education Secretary has claimed that people are turning to food banks because, and I quote, "they are not best able to manage their finances." How insulting, patronising and out of touch is that comment? There is a very straightforward way for ministers to clear up any doubt about the reasons for the increase in reliance on food aid, Madam Deputy Speaker. They can finally publish the official report into the growth of food banks, which was delivered to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in June. That report has now been sat on by ministers for 6 months, longer than it took to produce. In April, the then Minister of State at DEFRA, the Honourable Member for Somerton and Frome, said, and I quote, "The conclusions of this work will be available in the summer and published on the government's website." Now ministers say that the report is still being subjected to, and I quote, "an appropriate review and quality assurance process." I bet it is, Madam Deputy Speaker, I bet it is. It's very clear that the government is determined to hide the true scale of the growth of food banks. They are right to be embarrassed by the truth, but they should come clean. So I say to the Minister today, she should finally force her fellow ministers in DEFRA to publish this report. Madam Deputy Speaker, even without the government's hidden report, the reasons for the rise in food bank use is clear. It's the cost of living crisis facing householders up and down the country. It's because even as we see some growth finally in parts of the economy after 3 years of failure, that growth is not being shared fairly. Last week's ONS figures were clear. Average earnings have risen by less than the rate of inflation for the 5th year running. Figures published alongside the autumn statement showed that real wages will have fallen by 5.8% by the end of this Parliament. Under this government, we've seen the longest period of falling real wages since records began. And the consequence is that working people are £1,600 a year worse off under this government. And many, Madam Deputy Speaker, many are paid, many are paid poverty wages. Those paid less than a living wage, up by 1.4 million since 2009. 4.8 million workers in the UK last year. No, I've been very clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that I'm not giving way again in this debate. And as they As pay packets shrink in real terms, prices continue to rise, and they rise faster than wages. That has happened for 41 of the
I don't understand why there are conversations going on all around. I can see where the conversations are taking place, sir. All around the chamber. If people are here to take part in the debate, they must listen to the honourable lady who's proposing the motion. Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As pay packets shrink in real terms, prices continue to rise, and they're rising faster than wages. They've done that for 41 of the 42 months since this Prime Minister has been in Downing Street. Just take the weekly shop. No, just take the weekly shop. It's the essentials that have gone up in price the most. Food required for a balanced diet. Fruit, up 11.3%. Vegetables, up 6.9%. Meat, up 5.2%. Bread and cereals, up 4.3%. All up by more than inflation. And we know from DEFRA's own annual family food statistics, published last week, that families on the lowest incomes now spend 22% more on food in 2012 than 5 years ago. And these were already the families who had spent the largest share of their income on food. The consequences is families forced to trade down, with a third switching to economy brands. It's meant a quarter of those on low income now buying less fresh fruit, 1 in 5 buying fewer fresh vegetables. It means poorer nutrition for many children. And it isn't just food prices that are adding to the cost of living crisis, but household bills. Energy bills up almost £300 for families since the election, while company profits went from £2 billion to £3.7 billion. Over 2 million homes in England and Wales forced to spend more than 5% of their household income on the cost of water, including more than 500,000 families with children. Yet last year the regional water companies made £1.9 billion in pre-tax profits and paid out £1.8 billion to shareholders. And for those with children, I've made it clear why I'm not giving way. And for those with children, the rising cost of childcare is making it harder to take on work. The cost of nursery places is rising 5 times faster than pay, while there are 35,000 fewer childcare places and 576 fewer Sure Start centres. And most pernicious of all, the government's bedroom tax has increased the pressure on 660,000 people, including over 400,000 disabled people. Yet for the vast majority, they don't have a smaller place to move to. So the average family affected is now losing £720 a year. Madam Deputy Speaker, this debate is a vital opportunity for the House to acknowledge the rising reliance on food aid in our country. We have ensured that it's taking place because the government were never likely to do so. They won't even publish their own clearly damning research into why the rise of food bank usage is so high. Since April this year, 500,000 people have been helped by just one charity's network of food banks. 1/3 of those were children. And the reasons are clear. The rising cost of living caused by rising prices outstripping falling and stagnant wages. A government unwilling to stand up to vested interests in the energy and water companies or take action on the lack of available hours for part-time workers, the rise of zero-hours contracts and poverty pay, incompetent welfare reforms and delays in making payments, and the bedroom tax. Madam Deputy Speaker, Britain can do better than this. We need a long-term plan to tackle the cost of living crisis, to reduce dependency on food banks, including a freeze on energy prices while we reset the market, a water affordability scheme and tough new powers for Ofwat to cut bills, measures to end abuses of zero-hours contracts, make work pay contracts that reduce companies' tax bills to incentivise them to pay a living wage, an expansion of free childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds from 15 to 25 hours a week to help working parents, and the abolition of the bedroom tax. That's how we, a one-nation Labour government, would be addressing the standard food poverty in our country. That's how we will once again reduce and then remove the need for food aid and the reliance on food banks in our country.
Order. The question is, as on the order paper. Esther McVey.
Well, I welcome this debate today to answer honestly the points raised in the motion, to put clarity around this, but to be honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, a far more realistic debate would have been brought by these benches, would have been brought by the people of the United Kingdom to know how the opposition benches derailed the UK, destroyed the finances and made the UK such a vulnerable place. For whilst Labour was in office, I'll continue a little bit further because the truth must be heard. For whilst Labour was in office, Labour gradually wore away at the financial strength of this country, eroded its savings culture, and crashed the economy. No, gas bills doubled, council tax doubled, fuel duty went up 12 times. What Labour presided over, the only thing that it grew was in debt and overspending. It left the UK with...
Order! This is not a football match. Don't shout at the Minister. She will give way when she's ready to give way. Minister.
I think it's only fair I set the scene before I take interventions. So Labour left the UK with the highest structural deficit of any major advanced country, wiped £112 billion off the economy, giving debt of about £3,000 to every household, and personal debt reached a staggering £1.5 trillion. So this hurl of living beyond our means, this increase in prices, this increase in debt, this increase of unaffordability had to come to a stop, and it did also suddenly. Because sadly, very sadly, all of us now are paying the price of what happened. That is, government is paying the price, charities are paying the price, businesses are paying the price, and individuals are paying the price as we try to balance not only our household budgets, but also those of the country.
There is no point in having a debate if nobody listens to the person who is speaking. Be quiet. Minister.
As I've said, I will take interventions once I have set the, what has happened. So let's be honest here. The Trussell Trust saw what was happening back in 2000. It looked at the problem that was evolving from personal debt, from overspending, from living beyond our means, and it set up the first Trussell Trust in 2000, but it set up the actual network in 2004. The number of food banks grew tenfold until 2010. And what is most startling was that when they started, the Labour benches didn't want to know how this had happened. When they grew tenfold, they didn't want to know why this had developed. No. And when a Labour councillor who had set up the Trussell Trust came for support to say, allow me to signpost from the job centre pluses, Labour said no.
Yes.
Labour said no. Labour wanted it to be their little secret, because beyond the veneer of what might have seemed like a sound economy, it was crumbling, but they knew what was going to happen. And sadly, and shameful on the opposition benches, no investigation, no wanting to know what went on. It took the member of Harlow to speak with the Secretary of State to actually have this signposted. Now I have set the scene.
I thank the Minister for giving way. My constituency office took a phone call from an ex-serviceman yesterday, now thankfully in receipt of a war pension, DLA and ESA, but whilst waiting 4 weeks for Atos to deal with his appeal, had to use a food bank. Does the Minister not agree that is an absolute disgrace?
We have hardship payments, we have support payments, but what I will say too, we have put in a new element of reconsideration to make this quicker, and at the same time, actually, the actual transaction of getting benefits has actually increased in speed by 6 percentage points. But let's not get away from what happened and how this started underneath the opposition and what happened today. So this is what happened underneath the opposition benches. And so what I'd like to say, it is important what each and every one of us does. Of course, I hear nothing from the opposition benches today when we hear, through our Welfare to Work programme, 30 million people are in jobs today. 30 million people are in jobs today, whereas we know under Labour that actually the households with nobody working actually doubled. We know in the last term of Labour's office...
Order! There are too many people standing up. The Minister is not taking an intervention at this point. Allow her to make her speech. Minister!
The claimant count in the final period of Labour in office went up by 82%.
Very grateful to the Minister for giving way. And just in relation to the issue of referring, does she remember that the Trussell Trust thanked this government for allowing job centres to refer, which was a compassionate thing to do, refused by the benches opposite?
My honourable friend makes a very good point, and I will also give way to the honourable member who negotiated this on our side.
I'm hugely grateful to the Honourable Lady and for the work of the Secretary of State for actually changing the staff's disgraceful ruling from the last government. Will my honourable friend praise the Harlow Food Bank that was set up in 2009 after the years of plenty? And does she not agree that it is very, very sad that food banks are being turned into a party political football by the members of opposition, and they are trying to destroy the excellent work that they do?
I will indeed, because it is actually, if there was one thing that came out of the disastrous years that turned our country more vulnerable because of the disastrous finance from the opposition, was the fact that not only are the government doing more to get people into work, I'll say again, though I had no positive sounds from the opposite benches, 30 million people in work. It's not only the businesses have helped and support people and taking more people on, but actually the community has come together to support one and other, which must be a positive mood. No, I will make a little bit more progress. So let's go back to the report. So this was a report that obviously Labour didn't want to do, keep it as its little secret, didn't want to look into why Trussell Trust is set up. They didn't want to know why it had grown exponentially, but we did. So we've looked into this, but it's quite right that we give an accurate report. And from the party that brought us the dodgy dossier that never wanted verification of the facts, why let the facts get in the way of a fiction tale? So I think it is only correct. I think it's only correct that we get our facts right and deliver it at the right time. And remember, we're doing it. And as we're saying, it is positive that people are reaching out to support other people, from church groups to community groups to local supermarkets, some other groups. That's right. But what I'd also like to do is put this in context of also what's happening right round the...
We can't hear the Minister. Minister.
So, in the UK, it is right that, more people are visiting, which you'd expect. going to food banks, because as the time is tough, as time is tough, as we're all having to pay back this 1.5 trillion debt personally, which spiralled under Labour, as we're all trying to live within our means, change the gear, make sure we're paying back all our debt which happened under them. But what is happening right round the world, I think it's important to look at that. So in the UK, with a population of 63 million, there are 60,000 people going to the Trussell Trust on their figures. 60,000 people. However, in Germany, where the population is 82 million, there is now 1.5 million users going to this. And in Canada, where the population is 35 million, there are 830,000 monthly users at the Trussell Trust. So, Mr. Speaker, if we put everything in context, if we look, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we put everything in context, what had happened, so whether it was the overspending, not being able to balance the books from 2002, if it were the financial crash in 2007, look now at how much we have done to balance the economy, rebalance the economy, and get it on a stable footing.
Order! The House should just pause for a moment, calm down, listen to the Minister, then everyone will have a turn to make their point in due course. Order! Minister.
It's startling, isn't it, that the Shadow Minister on the opposite side took 3 interventions and we all listened. It would be actually quite appropriate if we listened to the facts, because I think that's where we go wrong, that we don't listen to what is going on. And if we could just do that. So if we see as a government now, as a coalition government, and remember, brought in to solve the mess that the opposition benches had put us in. And nothing more clearly says what we have done to support people, because the best way out of poverty is by getting people into work. That is the best way of helping people out of poverty. You are 3 times more likely to be in poverty as a child if you're in a workless household, and that is the party that gave us workless households. We have a record-breaking, I'm going to say it again because it still hasn't quite been acknowledged by the opposition benches, 30 million people in jobs today, which means we have a further 1.25 million people in jobs since the general election. The opposition told us...
If honourable members don't keep quiet and listen to the Minister will have to repeat her speech over and over again. Order! Order! And if the House keeps interrupting me, I will call order again and again, and very few people will have a chance to make the speeches they have prepared. Now, silence. Minister.
So there we have 1.25 million more people in jobs now than at the election. We know the best way out of poverty is by being in jobs, which we did. The opposition benches said there'd be 1 million more people out of work. You were wrong. The opposition was wrong. They also said double dip, treble dip recession. They were wrong. And may I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, on this issue, they are wrong too. And that is why we have to compare Labour's legacy of a debt-fuelled boom. That's why we've got to compare the two. What are we doing now? How have we supported people? Under Labour, 5 million out-of-work benefits. Number of households nobody's working doubled. 2 million children living in workless households. That is what we don't want. Shame, they say, from the opposite benches. And what is the help for families that we are doing? We want to make sure that work always pays. That is why we have brought in universal credit, to make sure that 3 million people are better off. This is what our side of the House are doing. Let's also be honest, one thing the opposition doesn't necessarily understand as well is disposable income is different to income. So what have we done to support people with disposable income? As I said, the opposition benches gave way 3 times. We will finish what we're saying. And should there be time, because I appreciate backbenchers have only got 4 minutes, I will give way. So what have we done here? We have taken 2.7 million people out of tax. We've cut tax for 25 million people, giving them on average £700 extra a year. We have stopped the opposition benches, fuel petrol prices increasing, saying families £300, or somebody who's in a business with a van £1,000. All of this is key to what we've done. Winter fuel allowance state, cold weather payment state. This is what we have done to support people, and tax breaks for young people who are now going to be in a job. And when we talk about what happened under what government, what happened when, how Trussell Trust started, when we also talk about removal of the spare room subsidy, again...
Order! Members must not shout at the Minister. It is clear that she doesn't intend to give way, and she's not going to give way more if you shout at her. Please be quiet, allow the Minister to finish her speech, and then everyone will have a chance to make their contribution. Minister.
So when we talk about the spare room subsidy, again, Trussell Trust started under Labour. They hid that away. And so did removal of the spare room subsidy start under Labour in 2008 when they did it in the private sector. So again, rewriting history doesn't really work. The British public want to know the truth. The Labour benches ruined the economy, and we are getting it right on tracks.
I'm very grateful to the Minister. On the one hand, she has spent a long time telling us that there are now so many more people, she says, in work, although the rate of employment has still not returned to pre-recession levels. But if she hasn't got her words out.
The Honourable Lady must be brief, but she must be heard. Sheila Gilmore.
If everything is going so well, why, since 2010, has there been such a substantial increase in the number of people using food banks? The only explanation can be the changes in welfare policies from this government.
I think that maybe tomorrow, when Hansard comes out, we can read the full explanation, because you probably don't want me to go through it again. Actually, it was because of the crash, the overspend, the personal debt, the public debt that actually the opposition benches left us with. And when we talk about another thing that was raised in this debate was 0-hour contracts. And this, was something that happened under Labour. In fact, the numbers in 2013 were the same as the numbers in 2000. In fact, 0-hour contracts went up 75% from 2005 and 2009. Something that the opposition benches did absolutely zero about. And can we also say that it is the Leader of the Opposition and his Doncaster Council that presides over the biggest number within his council of 0-hour contract. So again, a lot of fluster, a lot of bluster. The oppositions did nothing in government. They're doing nothing in control of the Labour councils, and yet we are now picking up the pieces. I will indeed give way.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and she's spoken eloquently of the price. road where my food bank is situated, you could walk down that road in 2009 and see in window after window repossession notices as house after house was taken away by banks which foreclosed on them. The grisly legacy of that lot wasn't just a loss of jobs, it was the loss of homes as well.
See, the opposition like to forget all about this. The industry I know most about is probably the construction industry, and actually that was brought to its knees in about 2007 underneath the guidance of the opposite benches. Many industries had a tough time pre-2010. That's when it all happened, and equally, the opposition is so bad with numbers, they don't understand, obviously, it needs to be a change of gear. When you rebalance economies, when you change things, when you do, to get things back on track, it doesn't happen overnight. It happens over a long period of time. But just something to ponder on a second, it was the opposite benches, the Shadow Secretary of State, who said, I want to be, or we will be, tougher on benefits. We will be tougher on benefits. We will do more than we're doing. So I just wonder how the opposition benches feel about that, or whether they believe then the use of the Trussell Trust would be higher or lower if that were to happen. So I will draw to come to a close now. Sadly, there is chanting from the opposition benches. You see, I find how the opposition benches left the country in a very vulnerable position. I find that a really sad moment. No?
Order. Allow the Minister to conclude her speech. Now, Minister.
Because I find that, for the people of the UK, deeply saddening. For me, that is not something to be chanting and cheering about. That is something for the opposition to really reflect from another about 20 years on what they have done to the UK PLC. Reflect while we get it right. So for those reasons, and many, many more, I reject the Opposition Day debate, mainly for its inaccuracy and everything that was put down there, and instead welcome the promising signs that we are delivering, both in jobs and in growth, the fastest in the G7 in this quarter, more people in work, more businesses going, more exports, more work for everybody. And I just want to say that is why we object to the motion and welcome what we are doing at this side of the bench.
Point of order. Sorry, Paul. Point of order, Madam Deputy Speaker. Point of order. Point of order.
On a point of order.
I'm very grateful, Madam Deputy Speaker. Given the huge interest in this debate, not least amongst our constituents, is it within your power, Madam Deputy Speaker, to extend the time for the debate?
I fully appreciate the point the honourable gentleman is making. Another way to phrase his point of order would be, had members behave with decorum during the speeches from the front bench, there would be more time for the back benches. The honourable gentleman is right in saying there's a lot of interest in this debate, but sadly it is not within my power to extend the time available. I'm glad the honourable gentleman has made his point of order, because it gives me the opportunity to ask honourable members to be courteous to other honourable members and keep their speeches as brief as possible. Paul Murphy.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Perhaps I can bring the House back to the issue of food banks. And say that I hadn't decided until a few days ago to take part in this debate, because I visited the Eastern Valley Food Bank in Pontypool in my constituency last Friday and saw their excellent work from my own eyes. And in that food bank, over a ton of food per week is distributed, feeding over 120 local families. And the demand is so great that they've opened 3 distribution centres in Blaenavon and Cwmbran, linked, of course, as it is, as many are in this country, to the Trussell Trust, and I pay tribute to their Welsh representative, Tony Graham. Indeed, the whole issue of food banks, when replicated throughout Wales, we can see that there are 33 food banks now, with 74 distribution centres, and in the United Kingdom, 3 opening every week across our country. The Honourable Lady...
Well, my right honourable friend give way. I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. When he visited the food bank, as I have most of my food banks, that there are so many of them, it's very difficult. But one thing I have noticed, and I wonder if he noticed on Friday, is the fact it's the type of person that's turning up at these food banks. A woman who was a skilled worker, a draftswoman, couldn't get a job and hasn't had a job for 4 years as a result of the government's policy. Did he see anybody like that?
Indeed I did, and I also saw, of course, that a large number of people who use our food banks nowadays are actually working people who simply do not have sufficient money in which to feed their families. But the Honourable Lady spent some time in trying to decide who caused the recession. But the reality is, since 2010, since the government has been in office over the last 3 years, in Wales alone, in 2010, over 4,000 people are now getting food from the food banks. In 2011, in Wales, that went to 16,000. In 2012, that went to 36,000. And in this year, it is estimated that 60,000 people in Wales will have to rely on food banks. That, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the population of my town, Cwmbran, which is the 5th largest town in Wales. It is a disgraceful indictment of society and what the government has done, or hasn't done.
I do thank my right honourable friend. Some people are having to go to food banks because of benefits problems. I have got clients who've come, constituents who've come to me where the problem has been that in one occasion, 6 months ago, they were assessed by capita for their personal independence payment. They still have not had that assessment passed on to the DWP because of failures of capita. I have others that have waited over 4 months. There are failures in the benefit system.
Well, the reality is, of course, that in Wales alone we know that in 2010, 13% of those who went to food banks went there because of problems with the welfare benefit system. Today it's gone up to 20%, and that's a reality. But of course there are other reasons too. Of course it's a question of electricity prices and gas prices and water prices. It's a question of the price of food that's gone up dramatically over the last number of years. And what's to be done about this? Well, the first thing we should do is to actually tackle the issue of the cost of living.
Speaker, I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for giving way. And can I ask, in terms of those increases in the cost of living, what contribution do you think the increases in council taxes in Wales will have contributed, where there has been a 9% increase in Wales over recent years, where it's been broadly flat in England?
Nothing like the effect of the cost of electricity and gas charges, that's for sure, on people's incomes. And it seems to me that we have to abolish the bedroom tax, because that's a huge issue which is actually affecting food banks. And in the meantime, I hope people will continue to donate and volunteer. The issue is that food banks, of course, show the best and the worst in our society. Local people in my valley have stepped up to help. Jen Taylor and her excellent team of volunteers have offered their time to help feed people and to give them hope. Churches, charities, offices, shops, individuals have donated huge amounts of food to supply the food bank.
Will my right honourable friend give way?
Finally, last one.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Will my right honourable friend agree with me that the churches in Wales have played a fantastic role in collecting the food?
Absolutely.
And in my constituency, the Diva Church, Calgary Church, the Catholic Church in Rill and Prestatyn, and the Wellspring Centre in Rill are all contributing to this.
I think the churches in Wales have done a tremendous job, right across the United Kingdom, in taking the lead very often on dealing with the issue of food banks. They are occasionally rewarded, of course. I was told the story of a little girl in Pontypool, in my constituency, who excitedly told a lady that you would have chocolate fingers for Christmas because the food bank was there and gave it to her. And that's a very moving story. But the problem really is of the indictment. I've been a representative public representative in my constituency for 40 years now, and I've never seen anything like this, other than at the time of the 1985 miners' strike, when the people of my valley got together as a community to help each other. This is happening now in a big way, but I never thought in my lifetime this was going to happen again. It's an indictment on our society, and it's an indictment on that government.
Laura Sands.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I just wanted to say what a very, very important description of all the different measures that we have taken to ensure that we support those who have, the greatest challenges in terms of poverty, in terms of low incomes, was given by my honourable friend from Wirral West. I think it's absolutely crucial that we are not here, and I do hope that the opposition are not here, to celebrate food banks. Food banks are not the answer. They must be seen as a transitional support mechanism for families in stress at particular moments. They are not a solution or something that we want institutionalised. And sometimes I feel that on the opposition benches we have got a relish about the number of food banks. If the opposition mentions some of the key reasons why we have a perfect storm that is particularly hitting those on low incomes and those on benefits, we might start to get to a series of solutions. Yes, I'll give...
Given way. Not only do I think she is right in assuming that there is a relish on the opposition benches about this, would she recognise that in her constituency, as in mine, food banks didn't come into being in May 2010. In fact, next year I'll be reading at the 10-year anniversary service of the Winchester Basics Banks. They've been around a long time.
I totally agree with my honourable friend. But let's go back to some of the reasons behind this. It's not, in many ways, many of the things that the opposition frontbench spokesman raised. Food price rises. They started in 2008. Food prices have gone up. Global commodity prices have gone up by 30%, very much under the last government. We actually linked our pensions to inflation in the first couple of years, where actually we're linking to that rise in cost of living. Global food prices are rising, and we need a solution to this. So why was it in 2010 that our domestic production of food, which would hedge our exposure to global food prices, had dropped to 48%? This government is actually addressing our food resilience and our long-term food production. Yes, I will.
Well, my honourable friend agree with me that it's rather disappointing that one group of people we haven't heard about today are the general public, who donate so generously to food banks, and that we ought to really express our gratitude to those in this debate.
I totally agree with you, and I have extraordinary people, committed volunteers in my constituency. Poorer families in my constituency also face structural poverty. Privately rented accommodation that have no cookers. They are captured by microwave food. They're condemned to expensive food with no resilience. We also have others who have to feed families of 3 and 4 with only one ring to cook with. These are things that we must address, and we must address the quality of our privately rented accommodation. I give way to the Honourable.
The Honourable Lady for giving way. I mean, she's raising some very interesting issues, but the Trussell Trust in Cardiff told me that half of the people referred to the food bank in the last 6 months were done so because of changes or delays to social security payments, unemployment, debt, low incomes, homelessness and domestic violence. Is she not surprised, therefore, that the government frontbench are not willing to take a shred of responsibility for that?
Absolutely we are, but the issue is that there are lots of background issues that we need to address. The next one is education. Where was food education on the agenda before this government put it into primary school education? It is now absolutely at the heart of citizenship and food education. We are absolutely important to build over the long term resilient families who can support themselves at a changing period when it comes to food price rises. But the last point is also about the food sector itself. And I've been campaigning very strongly against what we're seeing right across the retail sector. shrinkage in products, promotions that are not promotions, and even horse meat, which is a reflection of food crime. I am calling on the government to pull together a cross-departmental task force to look at the issues of food poverty, to ensure that we have a resilient set of policies that actually address the problem that food banks are creating, and ensure that we are actually putting together better housing, looking at our skill base and ensuring that the food system itself is underpinning the problems or supporting communities across this country that are finding food prices difficult to deal with, hard to manage. And I would say that we have got a very, very wide range of volunteers, people, the food sector itself, who are supporting food banks in the short term. But we must start looking at the long-term solutions. I just wish that this opposition motion had focused more on the long-term and the strategic problems that we're facing, and not on the short-term tactical politics.
Jamie Reid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I regret to say that I think that the laughter from some of the government benches as this debate was introduced says more about this issue than words ever could. But I'd like to start my remarks by praising the work of those in my constituency who do so much to help those who need it. The commitment shown by the volunteers in food banks throughout Copeland and across West Cumbria and towns like Whitehaven and Millham and Workington is remarkable. And on behalf of my constituents, I'd like to say thank you to them. Equally, I'd like to thank those who donate vast amounts to food banks, as without these donations, food banks simply could not operate. The final verdict on any government is how it treats the poorest in society during the hardest of times. The rise in the need for food banks is a horrifying indictment of the government's record, and one that demands an action. The complacency demonstrated by the frontbench opposite and their ministers in the other place is as distasteful and as unedifying as anything I have ever witnessed in Parliament. In July, Lord Freud seemed to suggest that the increase of those using food banks was simply down to their increased prevalence. He claimed he didn't know which came first, supply or demand, and claimed that there's an infinite demand for what he termed free goods. Now, I'm not one to second-guess the Minister's mind, but given that to be able to access the services of a food bank, a person or family needs to be referred by health services, local authorities and other groups that look after their welfare, his inference seems to be that there is somehow an ambition to reach hardship, a desire and aim for people to reach poverty, to get a free basket of shopping to get them to the end of the week. In order to better inform the parties opposite on how food banks actually operate, let me give them a quick rundown. People who were forced to turn to food banks can only receive help for a limited number of times. People aren't going off to the local food bank to do their full weekly shop, but because they need the bare essentials in order to get by. Many of these people will have already made extremely difficult decisions, such as whether to sit in a cold room rather than go hungry. No more harrowing example of this can be seen, Mr. Speaker, than in the fact that 1 in 5 mothers in the UK regularly...
Can we deal once and for all with this issue of food banks? As I understand it, it's partially right to say they've been around for about 10 years, but it's equally true that the churches set them up to deal with refugees coming to this country waiting for their asylum status to be determined. That's the truth of the matter.
My honourable friend makes a very telling and important point. I was explaining that 1 in 5 mothers in the United Kingdom regularly, not just once or twice a week, often skip meals in order to feed their children. Mr. Speaker, the situation that people find themselves in when they have to seek assistance to feed themselves and their families are not usually simple. They are often a combination of various issues which manifest themselves in a great deal of pain and pressure for those involved. In my own constituency, I have constituents who are cancer patients forced to use food banks as a result of various combinations of government policy. Mr. Speaker, I wish I could say that these were isolated cases, but they aren't. I wish I could say that the situation was improving, but it's not. There aren't even any signs of things getting better.
Grateful to my honourable friend. In Stoke-on-Trent, in just the last year and a half or so, over 100,000 kilos of food have been distributed, just in a small city. But on his point about the people that go to food banks, has he also seen, as I have, people who are absolutely on their last legs? They're so desperate, and they're also absolutely so embarrassed a lot of the time to need that help.
I absolutely have seen that, and I think that suggests that we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg for people who actually need the services of the food bank. In my constituency, there are around 600 extra people using food banks to ensure they can eat compared with last year, which brings the total to 1,778. This includes almost 700 children. That is truly shocking, and it's the policies of the parties opposite that have led to this huge growth in those needing help. Now, it's no coincidence that the wards in my constituency, with the highest rise in the number of children being fed through food banks, is correlated with the wards of the highest rates of child poverty. For example, in the ward of Saneth, 41% of children are now in child poverty, and 234 of those children rely on the generosity of those who donate to food banks. In my house, a third of children are in poverty, and over 200 of those rely on food banks. Child poverty and the use of food banks are inextricably linked, and yet this government has no credible plan to tackle either. Those of us on this side of the House have repeatedly warned the government, the benches opposite, that the legacy of their policies would be felt most keenly by the most vulnerable in our society. And the truth is that the very poorest are bearing the brunt of the cost of living pressures that the government's various regressive policies have created, and the consequences there for all to see. Mr. Speaker, there is a hidden country, unseen by this government, dismissed by this Prime Minister, and it shames them both. The working poor is this Prime Minister's emerging legacy, as millions of people live in quiet crisis. The explosion in food banks should haunt the Prime Minister, shame him and move him to act. I doubt that it will.
Mr. Steve Baker. Mr. Speaker, the quality and quantity of welfare produced by the state has not been good enough for a very long time. And it is astonishing and shaming that the welfare state can tax and spend so much and yet leave people hungry. 12,000 children in Buckinghamshire live in income poverty. 1 in 5 children in Wickham go to bed hungry, increasing to 1 in 3 in some parts of my constituency. It is a scandalous indictment of the safety net that is the welfare state that this happens. But I am proud of the One Can Trust, run by Sarah Mordaunt, Kate Vale, and over 100 volunteers in Wickham, which steps in with emergency food when the state fails. I will give way to the Honourable Judge.
I'm grateful to him, but I think a mistaken impression has been created in this debate that all that food banks do is distribute emergency food, whereas what they actually do is give financial advice and debt advice to people who've got into difficult situations, and the emergency food is only part of what they do.
Indeed, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. Indeed, the One Can Trust also provides recipes which help people get through and use that food effectively. The One Can Trust has delivered 2,859 parcels since March 12, reaching 3,182 adults and over 2,000 children. Without them, poverty in Wickham would be truly desperate. They operate 5 pick-up centres, 8 sessions at which people can pick up food. They deliver usually within 24 hours. They enjoy support from the Big Yellow Storage Company. They've got matched funding from Barclays and Santander. Warm drinks are provided to volunteers by Starbucks. The Eden Centre provides parking for volunteers. It is an astonishing exercise of social power, and I am very, very proud of what they're doing, in particular because of the story of one young boy. This is a young boy who, about 33 years ago, at the age of, I guess, 8 or 9, bounced down the stairs because his loving father called him down for his tea. And this boy bounced joyfully down the stairs, but thought it was funny in his youthfulness and his childishness to poke the fried egg and say, "Ugh, what's that?" At which point his father, with his great working man's hands, picked up that plate of food and slung it straight in the swing bin and bellowed, "All right, we'll both go hungry." So that was my father. My father, a working man who had reached the end of the money and the end of the food. Now, I did not mean to wound my father then, nor do I mean to wound him now, because he loved me and he loves me still. My father did absolutely everything that he could, but where was the welfare state? It was not there for him, because it did not know what to do for an independent, self-employed man who'd run out of work. Now, unfortunately, this went on, to and fro, in the legacy, I'm afraid, of the preceding Labour government. It was tough for a self-employed builder. Now, my father coped by finding further work, my mother taking on 2 and even 3 tough jobs. I saw her get arthritis in her hands to age early, all because there was no food. What happened eventually, of course, is they divorced and my mother went on to live with a man who could at least put food on the table. So I certainly know the consequences. I live with the consequences today of having too little food in a home. And so I am proud of the One Can Trust, that they, in times of crisis, feed families. I like to believe that had there been food available in my home when I was a child, not only would my father not have had to go hungry, perhaps my mother wouldn't have had to take on those jobs. Perhaps they would not have divorced. Perhaps a range of things which ought not to have happened, but which did, would never have taken place. And I am very proud indeed that in this country, at this time, people across our nation are stepping up where the state is falling that little short. But what I would have to say is, what is the cause of the crisis? The cause of this crisis has been, I'll just make this point, the cause of this crisis has been pretending that there is some magic wand, that prices can be declared to be lower, that wages can be declared to be higher, that somehow the state, if only members opposite were on these benches, that somehow the state would be responsive and very quickly leap in times of crisis. It's not true. It is not true now. It wasn't true 33 years ago. It will not be true in the future. It is essential that things like food banks step in, but I'm encouraged by things like the community store, which go further and make this kind of mutuality and cooperative, this charitable endeavour, much more sustainable by making inexpensive food available to the working poor. I'll leave the final word to the chairman of One Can Trust, David Rook. He said, David Cameron has got it exactly right. Society needs to be empowered to step up. That's what the One Can Trust is all about. And, Mr. Speaker, I am proud of them.
Jessica Morden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was emailed last Friday by a woman in my constituency who asked me to attend this debate, and she said, I would ask you if you could attend to represent the poverty and daily struggle that can be found in our area. I am writing as a former user myself of the food bank, which at the time was a lifesaver for me. At the beginning of this year, the DWP sanctioned me for 6 months due to an administrative error, which I did not ever receive a written apology for. I had to live on £27 a week for 6 months until my support worker found out and helped to get me back on my feet. I'm not a waster or a shirker, but having to receive food parcels because you have nothing in your cupboards is embarrassing for anyone. I also know people who work as hard as they can, but because of low wages can't manage. Powerfully put, and I hope if the Minister listens to nothing else today, she will listen to that. Now, it is fair to point out that food banks are not a new thing in this country. When I was elected, there were 2 in Newport, the Raven House Trust and the King's Church, and they did an amazing job. But the difference is... I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Is she slightly shocked, as I am, that there isn't a single DWP or a DEFRA minister now sitting on the front bench?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and indeed a valuable intervention, and I think it speaks volumes. But the difference is that back then, when I first went to meet volunteers packing food hampers, those receiving them were primarily of a much smaller number, and as my honourable friend said, were predominantly in a dispersal area, were asylum seekers, people with drug and alcohol problems, and homeless people. And I'm glad the food banks were there to help them, because those recipients were badly in need of our help. But there are now 4 food banks operating around Newport, joined recently by the Caldecott Food Bank and the Trussell Trust, who now have 4 satellite distribution centres to their centre. We have a mixture in Newport of independent and Trussell Trust food banks, but they all work together, but they say exactly the same things when asked. There's been a phenomenal increase in demand over the past year or 2. They've seen a large number of working families on low incomes in need, and they've seen a marked increase in referrals from DWP job centre staff because of the bedroom tax, sanctions and other benefit changes. It's difficult. I give way. I'm sorry.
I thank the honourable lady for giving way. The food bank in Chesterfield, which opened 6 months ago, has reported that 50% of people who are presenting to the food bank are there because of benefit changes, benefit sanctions, and because the DWP has really messed up. Now, in what way does she think this is not the responsibility of the DWP and the government actively forcing people into food banks?
My honourable friend is exactly right, and I do wish there was a minister from the Department of Work and Pensions in order to listen to that point.
Where is he?
The depressing Wales-wide figures from the Trussell Trust show that in 2010 to 2011, they supported 4,070 individuals in Wales. But this year, just from April to November, they've supported 44,756. And as my right honourable friend said, they expect that to be 60,000 by the end of the financial year. And that's just the Trussell Trust, not the independent food banks. The unmistakable message, which I've been told time and time and again, is the explosion of people using food banks who are in work. Unemployment may be down, and I definitely welcome that, but the use of food banks by working people is dramatically up, and that should tell the government something. And the other truth is that whatever the Secretary of Work and Pensions says is that the proportion of people using food banks as a result of benefit changes is sharply increasing. And the government had even shamefully, and it is shamefully, altered the form used by Job Centre Plus staff when referring clients for food parcels by taking off the tick box which records that they were referring them because of benefit changes. No wonder the Secretary of State can play down that benefit changes are driving the increase in demand, because he stopped his staff collecting the data which proves it. Can I thank all those involved in food banks for the work they do in my constituency? Not least the contribution for our churches, who are also people, let's remember, running our night shelters, running our street pastors, and should be praised for the work that they do. And to the King's Church in Newport, who partner with FareShare to reduce food waste and feed people at the same time. And to businesses like Newport Bus, who have been collected for Raven House this Christmas. And I will end on this. However raucous... I will carry on a little bit. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend. Does she also wish to thank those people who are donating to the food banks? Today, my office has taken a phone call from someone who said they won a food hamper in a raffle. They cannot eat that food hamper knowing people are starving. They are taking it to the food bank.
I thank my honourable friend, and that was indeed a valuable contribution, and we should thank those who give to food banks. But I will end on this. However raucous these debates, and however characteristically chippy the Ministry's response will be, it is worth reminding ourselves about the real people behind the figures. The two young boys who came into a Newport food bank recently with their social worker. They asked if they could have one packet of cereal and one packet of drinking chocolate as a treat. Sad stories, real lives.
Sir Stephen Mosley.
At the end of last month, I was privileged to be able to visit the West Cheshire Food Bank in my constituency, which, like all food banks, is run by a group of hard-working volunteers and supported by generous donations from across Chester. My visit to the food bank was not just an opportunity to see the fantastic volunteers that make it happen. It was also to hear first-hand about the reasons why people are using food banks, and the results were striking. Figures from my local food bank show that of those who have used a food bank since April this year, 59% have visited because of changes to benefits. And a growing number of people are visiting the food bank because of sanctions. Now, I will give way briefly.
The honourable gentleman for giving way, because he's mentioning his own food bank. The food bank in my constituency, run by a joint venture with the Trussell Trust and the Blythswood Cafe, have had a 6 times increase this year alone, mainly due to benefit changes. The government will not listen to us on the benefit changes, and perhaps, giving his wonderful start to his speech, he might put pressure on his own ministers, who quite frankly have been deplorable in this chamber this afternoon, to get them to see sense and make the changes so people do not starve this winter.
I will come on to that point, but the Department for Work and Pensions is a frontline organisation that was dealing with these people, and that's why I support wholeheartedly the government's decision to allow job centres to advertise and refer people to their local food bank. And that is why it is also such a big mistake for the last government to ban job centres from referring people and to deprive people of the information that they needed to get food at times of emergency. Let's make no mistake about it. Food banks were not created by, for or because of this government. They predate this government and predate recent welfare changes. They reflect deep, long-term problems within our benefit system. Because the majority of people that need food bank assistance are those facing changes to benefits, the clear long-term solution is a more joined-up benefit system. The solutions that have been put forward by the opposition in their motion today do not tackle the root cause of this problem. They are short-term sticking plasters that merely cover up the cracks in the welfare system. What is needed is a long-term solution to fix the problem once and for all. I will give way briefly.
To him. I wonder whether he can help us with this puzzle. A lot was made perfectly properly by ministers when they took office and announced that in the future job centres would be able to refer people to food banks. However, that appears now to have changed. A written answer on the 4th of September from the former Minister saying this: Job Centre Plus does not refer people to food banks or issue vouchers. Can he help us to understand why has there been that change?
But they do offer signposting and they do offer advice and they point people in the right direction. Exactly. But unlike the members opposite, I do think that the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions knows what the problem is. And that is why he is pushing so hard for universal credit, which will transform welfare, solving many of the issues that we've heard about today that still haunt our welfare system. As well as a long-term solution of universal credit, there are some short-term actions that we can take as well. Firstly, we need to find out more about food banks, and I would back the Trussell Trust's call and the call from the member from South Thanet earlier for an inquiry into their use. We need to get a clear picture of the role and the extent of food banks, and we need to know who uses them and why. Then we can have a debate that is based upon the facts. Otherwise, this important debate will always run the risk of being hijacked by politicians hoping to score cheap political points. And that does nothing, absolutely nothing, to help those in need. The University of Warwick have produced a report for DEFRA on household food security and the provision of food aid, and I do hope that this report will be forthcoming. Secondly, I'm a passionate believer in school meals. In my constituency, I have seen the real difference that they can make for children, providing a hot, nutritious meal every day. So I want to congratulate the government on introducing free school meals for infant pupils. By opening up free school meals to all children, we can put nutrition first. And finally, we need to give food banks the support that they need. Too often, people suggest that we should be ashamed of food banks. I actually disagree. Food banks play a key role in a caring society, with dozens of people in my constituency volunteering at the Wesley Methodist Church and hundreds, if not thousands, of people donating food. I am proud that so many Chester residents want to help their neighbours and their local communities when they are in need. I would like to offer my heartfelt thanks to everyone who helps at West Cheshire Food Bank. They are really doing a truly fantastic job.
Point of order, Mr Derek Twigg.
Mr Speaker, thank you for taking that. Is it a discourtesy to this House that the two ministers who got responsibility from the Department of Works and Pensions for this debate haven't been in this House on the front bench for quite some time, and neither would DEFRA, because it is called Food Banks, are here, not here today neither?
The organisation of the bench rota by the government is a matter for ministers to decide. I note that the honourable gentleman regards it as unusual, and that view may be widely shared, but it is not within the power of the Chair to change that situation, even if the Chair were minded to do so. It is beyond my physical powers. Perhaps we can leave it at that. Sir Gerald Kaufman.
Mr Speaker, it is disgraceful that the junior minister, having made one of the nastiest front-bench speeches that I have heard in my 43 years in this House, should now have sloped off and not bothered to listen to the views of the House. Last Sunday, Mr Speaker, I attended a carol service at New Covenant Church in my constituency, and a leaflet of activities distributed to the congregation said, "Food Bank to alleviate poverty among the unemployed and low-income earners." The previous Sunday, I attended a carol service at St Chrysostom's, again in my constituency, and Canon Iain Gummersall, who always makes an appeal at that service. In previous years, he has made a speech for poverty abroad, for example, an orphanage in Romania. Sunday of last week, he made an appeal for food for hungry people in the area around the church, and he said that the prospect was that there will be soup kitchens in my constituency. Mr Speaker, Mr Gummersall is not political. but he felt he had to say that to a crowded congregation. And yes, of course, I'll give way to the Honourable.
I share his complete concern on this issue, but does he realise that in Germany, a country much richer than ours, 6 million people use food banks every month?
It was 1.5 before, make your mind up. So where's the follow-up?
My constituents who are going hungry don't study the Foreign Affairs pages. They want to know why, after 3.5 years of this appalling government, they've not got any food. So don't let the honourable gentleman make these silly, useless debating points. The Salvation Army has sent round an appeal saying, in the present economic climate, many families will struggle to feed and clothe their children, let alone afford presents and treats. Tesco, in my constituencies, in so many constituencies, is working... Yes, I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Isn't he actually detailing the symptoms of inequality that are massive in our society? The professors say Stiglitz and Krugman have actually detailed that the gains of productivity have gone to the top 1%. We're living in the fourth most unequal society in the OECD. Successive UK governments have failed, and that's one reason I want Scottish independence, but that's for another day. But what he's seeing in his constituency is the result of this huge, massive inequality that is blighting our society.
The honourable gentleman is, of course, absolutely right. And the information provided for me by Tesco, who are conducting food banks in my constituency, tells the whole story. Tesco's third national food collection, i.e., they've started within the period of office of this government to help to address food poverty. 32,000 shopping trolleys, the equivalent of 4.3 million meals. That's Britain today, Mr. Speaker. If you'll allow me for just a moment. The situation in my constituency is we have widespread poverty and deprivation. Today's unemployment figures show that we are number 42 in unemployment out of 650 constituencies. And this has not come about by accident. It is the direct result of this government's policies, the deliberate creation of unemployment, the bedroom tax, which is causing so many people to suffer, the benefits cuts, the housing shortage. My city has been hit hardest of all the major cities in the country by the government's cuts. And what we are having is redistribution from the poor to the affluent. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Grateful. Last week I visited Kids Company in Southwark and saw the industrial scale packing of food bags that were then being piled out into vans and delivered to vulnerable families across London. When I asked Camilla what had changed in the last few years, she said she's still getting the same number of abused kids, but what she is now getting directly are hungry kids coming to her directly because they are starving. Does he think this is a damning indictment of this government?
Well, let me think about that for a minute.
Really powerful point. But if I may say to her, powerful as she has made it, it was made much more powerfully by St. Matthew in his Gospel, who said, "Unto every one that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance. But from him that hath not shall be taken away even that which he hath." That is the precise policy of this Conservative Liberal Democrat country. And I note that the only Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Manchester hasn't even bothered to turn up to this debate. That will be noted by his constituents. At our Gorton Philharmonic concert at Christmas, we sing "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas." Well, Mr. Speaker, it will be a little Christmas for a lot of people, but it won't be merry for many more.
Sir Roger Williams.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm very pleased that this debate has entered a calmer stream, a cooler stream, because I felt very uneasy that some of the very some of the most vulnerable people that I've met in my constituency were being used as a political football across this chamber. And they would not have wanted that. They would not have wanted that. They would not have wanted that. They feel a sense of indignity very often about going to food banks. They feel in some ways it's their own fault. Well, in many cases it was not their fault at all. And I look to both sides of the House to come forward with considered ideas about how we can best address this matter. Yeah. Okay. Anyone?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I give the honourable member one suggestion? Why doesn't his government meet the Trussell Trust to try and understand the causes of food insecurity instead of refusing to meet them?
I thank the honourable lady for that. I'm being encouraged by an honourable member to my left here that the government has that intention to meet the Trussell Trust. So I'm very pleased about that. Can I just say that food banks have come rather late to my constituency, but I really welcome them. I went to the New Life Church in Llandrindod Wells, and what I was very impressed about was the number of volunteers that were working there. They were both members of that church and other volunteers who coming into the church, particularly to distribute the food. But we then went on to Tesco's, and I'm not often seen to compliment Tesco's on their work, but in this matter they were doing very, very good work indeed. And the church had a stall on the exit of the store, and people were encouraged to make donations from the food that they were buying. And I was overwhelmed by the generosity of the people, very often on low incomes themselves, who were prepared to put a little away in order to help other people. And Tesco's themselves were able to make a contribution of 30% as well.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Yes, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I share his sentiments in relation to the food banks that I've visited. But in his 16 years in this place, would he not agree that in good times and bad, that even though food banks came to his constituency more recently, in each of those years there would have been constituents for whom they would have found great benefit in the availability of the services of food banks if they'd been there at the time?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that. I haven't quite yet achieved 16 years, although it is my intention to, if I am successful at the next election. But he's quite right that, and I'm sure honourable members all share this, when we sit in our surgeries, it's only not just lately that we've had people who come to us because they have had problems with their benefits and are in real desperate and dire circumstances. I'll just make this point. Well, before the food bank was established in my constituency, I had no organised place to refer them to. I had to find churches or philanthropists almost who were able to help them out of that trouble, get them through that period of dire trouble. Now, with the food bank there, at least I can direct them to somewhere where they will get help. Yes, I will give away.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. He mentions benefits. Would he not agree that the best way out of poverty is actually through work? But is it not also because of the dog's dinner of the benefit system that we've in fact inherited with its perverse incentives, which actually means that gaining part-time work, you can be worse off than if you stayed on benefits?
I do agree that getting into work is the best way out of poverty, but work is not always available for people, and I'm sure honourable members will have had that experience as well. Okay.
Thanks very much for giving way. But does the honourable member not agree with me? A lot of people who are claiming food parcels from food banks are actually in work.
Well, I'm sure that's acceptable. I've just tried to respond to my honourable friend as well, and I do believe that the benefit system that we have got at the moment is not fit for purpose. I do believe that this government is making progress to get that better, but there's still a huge amount of work to be done. And the conditionality of so many benefits at the moment does raise difficulties. And I've got experience in my constituency where Job Centre Plus in different towns seems to be using different criteria for imposing sanctions on people. And when those sanctions are imposed, obviously, they are in great difficulty. I think as well as... OK, all right.
As a member of one of the governing parties, what is he saying to the ministers about this sanctioning disaster?
But I've already written to a minister, and I'm going to meet with a minister to find out why in different job centres the sanctions seem to have different criteria, and they have different systems of writing or contacting people to encourage them to come to meetings. If they don't come to the meetings, they get sanctioned. Sorry, I've almost run out of time. I've been very generous. I'd just like to say that I think this country actually needs a food policy. We've seen... No, I won't. I'm terribly sorry. If I would have, but we need a food policy. We've seen huge spikes in food prices, which actually add to the difficulties of people trying to budget. We need to be able to get a system of ensuring that we have a secure supply of food with averaging prices. This week coming, I'll be meeting the pastor in Elim Church in Brecon. Hopefully, we'll be able to work with that church to set up our second food bank. I do it with a heavy heart in many ways, but I do it knowing that it will provide really good help for my constituents.
Spirit to the honourable gentleman. There's nothing so striking as a member busily congratulating himself upon his own generosity. Mr. Frank Field.
From the government side, we've heard often the citing of the use of food banks on the continent. And in my short contribution, I want to suggest two things. One is that there are now movements in Western economies which are disadvantaging the poor, and we need to think about answers to that. But also, secondly, to suggest things to the government where their policies have made this position much, much worse. We may not yet understand those more basic forces to which we may put policies to, but the government could actually raise the questions of its own policies and how that is impoverishing people. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, the reasons for the absence of the whole of the DWP from the front bench is that they're actually thinking about what sort of reply they're going to give to this debate. With those concessions in mind. 15 months ago, the Trussell Trust said that by the general election, they would be feeding 500,000 of our constituents. I asked the Prime Minister at Prime Minister's question time what was he going to do to prevent that prediction becoming true. I didn't get a comprehensive answer, to put it mildly. We learned from today's debate that that 500,000 point has already been passed a year and a quarter, a year and a third before that general election. So the numbers will continue to increase. And if we look at the data, we find that in our country, the proportion of income the poor now have to spend on both food, both utilities, and on rent is rising. And I think that's the reason why we've got an answer to Lord Freud, who said that if you supply a free good, people turn up and claim it. It might be that if you're worried about not being able to meet your rent or your electricity being cut off, and there is the possibility of some food that people will give you, then of course you take that opportunity so you can meet other requirements of that basic budget. But yes,
giving way. And of course the figures for food banks only tip the iceberg, because there are many other locations where people go to get free food, soup kitchens, other locations as well. And these have also seen a big increase in their usage over the last few years, and that's part of the picture as well.
I totally accept that point, and I'm actually going to come back to it, if I may, how inaccurate our data is on the whole of this issue. But we do need, as a House, to take into account something very important is going on in our economy, which is most disadvantaging the poor. We're seeing, I mean, my honourable friend said here, I think he didn't actually know Frederick Engels, but Engels prophesied that as countries become richer, their proportion they spend on food declines. That law has been reversed. So on that score, something fundamental is happening. And if you combine it with the changes, the proportion now having to be spent on fuel, the proportion that has to be spent on rent, difficult for many people, a disaster for the poor. So because there's so many people who want to come in, I address the questions. I won't give way because so many people want to actually participate. The questions I'd like to ask the government, why are they so frit of looking at a serious inquiry to the causes of what's going on? Are food banks a passing fancy, or are they the outward visible sign of something very serious happening in our economy? We ought to actually get an answer to that. But secondly, if you listen to the food banks and the other bodies which are handsomely filling the ranks of help in our society, they say that the two things which are increasingly important driving people to food banks are the sanctions regime, which is very much, and the sheer incompetence of the DWP in actually relaying benefits. Could the Minister, whoever it is, wherever they are, when they come to reply, could they tell us how many of the payments, the exceptional payments they're making because of benefit delays? And will an instruction go out from this government twofold? One, that they will actually ensure that anybody who has actually waited more than a week for their benefit can have an advance on the benefit that they're entitled to, which will then be clawed back later. No one's disputing that. That would actually abate some of the demands for the food banks. And secondly, given what's actually happening to those people who are being sanctioned, where the sanctions are then later overturned, might they urgently review how just their sanctions policy is?
Sony Baldry.
Speaker, due to the time limits, I had to significantly reduce what I intend to say in this debate, but I will ensure a full copy is put on my website. May I, in following the Right Honourable Gentleman, commend to the House the report by the Church Urban Fund, published in September this year, entitled Hungry for More, How Churches Can Address the Root Causes of Food Poverty. And the report can be found at www.cuf.org.uk/research. Now, as part of their mission to the communities which they serve, and as part of their mission as the national church, thousands of parish churches around the country play an active role in their local community, including running food banks, the majority of which have been set up in the past 2 years. And the report of the Church Urban Fund suggests that if churches are to contribute to a long-term solution to food poverty, there is a need to rebalance church-based activity away from emergency crisis support and towards long-term work that tackles the underlying problem. And there is a policy conundrum here, which I think the whole House has to recognise. Food banks do not tackle the root causes of food poverty. Food banks do not aim to resolve any of the underlying problems of food poverty, and I suspect that everyone in the House would agree that we should view food aid only as a short-term emergency response to problems of food poverty.
What food banks do, but food banks also give advice on debt recovery. Christians Against Poverty is an example of what food banks do in Northern Ireland. Does he recognise the good work that they do to advise people how to best manage their resources and get themselves out of the benefit traps that they're in?
Actually, as the research shows in the Church Urban Fund report, some food banks do that, but not enough do it. Many food banks are simply giving food aid. That's important, but one needs to move on with development to longer-term solutions. The root causes need to be tackled in... May I make some progress, please? The root causes need to be tackled in order for the situation to be resolved. In April this year, an online survey was sent to 3,000 Church of England incumbents. And in that survey, the Church Urban Fund asked the clergy questions about their perceptions of food poverty and what was actually going on in their own parishes. These are parish clergy in parishes right across the country. The respondents were invited to indicate what they considered to be the causes of food poverty based on their experience involved with running food banks. The figures come to more than 100% because some clergy chose more than one topic, but 62% chose low income, 42% chose benefit changes and 35% indicated benefit delays. And as it happens, these three issues match those identified by the Trussell Trust as the most common reasons for food bank referrals last year. And it's also worth noting that a number of respondents also believed individual behaviour to be a contributing factor, with 27% selecting poor household budgeting as a significant cause of food delay. Now, these results, alongside those others set out in the report, suggest that if churches are to contribute to a long-term solution to food poverty, there is a need to rebalance church-based activity away from emergency crisis support and towards long-term work that tackles the underlying problems. The Joseph Browntree Foundation, in their recent report on monitoring poverty, observed that making comparisons of people using food banks over time is not easy, as there are simply more food banks now than 5 years ago. They may well be meeting a need that was previously going unmet. However, there is obviously a need to have a look at the impact of benefit changes and particularly benefit delays. And a word of caution in all of this. If I may, I'm going to make my own speech in my own time, and I'm conscious there are large numbers of honourable and right honourable members who want to take part in this debate. A word of caution in all of this. Whoever is in power after the next general election, public spending is going to be difficult. Indeed, as far as I can discern, all three main parties are agreed on the public spending limits to at least 2016-17. And although the Labour Party have opposed every single welfare change by the present government, I don't think the opposition is suggesting they would have elected significantly increase the overall welfare budget. So I think in those circumstances it's disingenuous to suggest that somehow a future Labour government would increase individual welfare spending any more than a future Labour government would have the ability to control food and commodity prices. The Church of England has just embarked on a one-year joint research project with Oxfam in partnership with the Trussell Trust and Church Action on Poverty, with the aim of exploring the reasons why people are using food banks and identifying interventions that would reduce the need for food bank use in the future, and these fundings will be published in September of next year. What I don't think is an adequate policy response is simply to say because people are using food banks, this means there needs to be a massive increase in welfare spending at a time when I think everyone is in agreement that as a nation we have to get welfare spending under control.
Williams.
33 food banks operate in Wales, 2 in my own constituency, 1 in Caernarfon and 1 in Bangor. In 2011, 11,000 Welsh people depended on food banks for the limited help. Now the figure is 60,000. People often go to food banks because their benefits have not been paid, as the Right Honourable Member for Birkenhead said a moment ago. There's been a mistake, benefits are paid too late, people have been sanctioned, sometimes wrongly so. A man came to see me on Monday. He'd been sanctioned, he had no money. He'd been called for an interview but wasn't able to go because he had to take his wife, his very seriously ill wife actually, to a hospital for cancer treatments. And he couldn't be 30 miles away at the same time. And he was sanctioned. Yes, I will, this once.
Which, forgive me, a gentleman in my constituency faced exactly the same. He was sanctioned, albeit he was in hospital for a heart condition. He lived for a further 3 days on field mushrooms and borrowed eggs. Is that what we want to see in the UK in 2013, 2014?
Well, the honourable gentleman makes a very eloquent point about the harshness of the current system. Significantly, about 20% of the people who go to food banks are the working poor. And these are not the scroungers or the shirkers quoted so enthusiastically by some honourable members and also the popular newspapers. Now, the growth of food banks in Wales is a symptom, I think, of a much more fundamental problem, that's of growing inequality and the failure of wages and incomes to match the ever-increasing cost of living, particularly food inflation. This is a particularly acute problem in Wales, where GVA in some areas is about 60% of the UK average. I give way a second and final time.
I wonder if the honourable gentleman has also found that the working poor are also finding it difficult to get basic products. My food bank has told me that sometimes they're having people talking to staff quietly and saying, do you actually have toilet paper? Do you have sanitary products? It's not just food, it's the expensive other products.
Well, the honourable lady makes a fine point. I was at the food bank in Caernarfon recently, and they do provide a range of goods, and at Christmas time they also provide a few extras, which I think is very welcome indeed.
Food banks currently provide a vital short-term service and they deserve our support. But they must not be a general, long-term solution for the individuals who go to them, and certainly not a permanent aspect of public policy. Food banks, if we have them at all, should supplement public provision, and it is astonishing, is it not, Mr Speaker, that it is indeed shameful that in the second decade of the 21st century, in one of the richest countries of the world, we cannot even make sure that our people get sufficient food. Now, in Wales, we have had a consistent... well, I will actually...
Thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he recognise the importance of welfare benefits advice? We've heard that many food banks provide this, but there are many who don't. And since we know that part of the reason for the growth in food banks is the paucity of proper welfare advice, isn't that an important consideration in this debate?
Well, it is indeed, and I pay tribute to the services that we have. They are patchy, sometimes provided by local authorities and sometimes by volunteers. And I would mention in passing the point made by the Child Poverty Action Group, a very pertinent point to this debate about the value of advice and the level of underclaiming, of course, which is a consistent problem. In Wales, we've had a consistent decline in our economic performance and in people's ability to buy the food they need. The figures, Mr Speaker, are quite stark. Wales' GVA per head compared to the UK average in 1997 was 78.1%. In 2011 it was 75.2%, a decline of 3%. For West Wales and the valleys, which are recognised by the European Union as some of the poorest areas in the European Union itself, the figure was 67.2% in 1997, 65% in 2011, a further decline. So there is here a substantial historical problem, and it is a problem that is growing. Now, the remedies, I'm sure, are quite easy to list, and we've heard some of them already. Better economic growth, better income distribution, particularly in the poorest areas, a living wage, ending fuel poverty, and, of course, we have already heard a number of calls, and I think I'll have to just proceed and finish. I apologise to the honourable gentleman. We call on the government, of course, to publish the DEFRA commissioned report into food bank use. And the government should commission further wide-ranging research into the rocketing need for food banks. And certainly I would make a point to the front bench, of the opposition front bench. I can't see how regional benefits would help. Mr Speaker, a final brief point, but it is an important one and one which hasn't been mentioned so far. Wales is not a unique case in the UK, certainly not a unique case in the European Union. We must look beyond our own borders and beyond Europe's borders and fight to provide food security for people all over the world.
Alan Cairns. Thank you, Mr Speaker, for giving me the opportunity to contribute in this debate. I welcome the debate. I think it's an opportunity to analyse the role of food banks, the background and why they're growing at the reported rate. I will say, though, Mr Speaker, I'm extremely disappointed in the way that this debate is being proposed and the way in which political capital is being sought on some of the most vulnerable people that genuinely need support, where we need to analyse and understand and get to grips of the longer-term issues that has led people into the situation where they need to turn to food banks. I think that, I will give way in a moment, I think that the tone of the debate and the motion itself really undermines the good work that food banks do and the excellent support that are given by so many volunteers that are working really hard for some of the most vulnerable people in their constituency. I'll give way to the honourable member.
Giving way, does he share my regret that sadly the Minister chose to actually make out as if we should be grateful that more people aren't having to go to food banks, rather than actually recognising that the debate we're having here today isn't about economic statistics. It's about the fact that our fellow men and women in our country are having to go to a food bank to feed themselves. Exactly. The tone of this debate is actually disgraceful and shameful.
Absolutely. absolutely recognise the tone of this debate is disgraceful, but these are the issues that need to be analysed. These are the issues that we need to address in an adult way in order to understand the longer-term issues that has got us to this position. It hasn't happened since 2010. It goes back well beyond that, and it needs to be addressed in a proper, adult, consensual way. I'll happily give way to the honourable member.
On that point, will my honourable friend, first of all, support the volunteers, particularly the church groups and Braintree throughout this country, who are doing a tremendous job in supporting food banks. But on the point that he just made, this is a long-term problem, and the inconvenient truth the other side will not accept is that there has been a tenfold increase from 2005 to 2010 of food banks. This is not a problem that began in 2010, and we do need a long-term solution.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for making that powerful point, and it leads me on to give me the opportunity to pay tribute to those people who work and organise the food banks in the Vale of Glamorgan. There's Coastlands Family Church, Bethesda Chapel in Dinas Powys, and Bethel Baptist Church in Llantwit Major. For me, food banks play an extremely important role in bringing people back into the state system of support, or in pointing them in the direction to the relevant charity that can absolutely help them and support them to get to that underlying long-term issue that has been missed, or the situation in which they find themselves at that time. Because we need to recognise that the food banks and the Trussell Trust, who facilitate those that I've mentioned in my constituency, rightly limit the provision that they make available. One, they have to have a voucher. That voucher has to come from a recognised body. It may well be the social services, it may well be the GP, it may well be a women's aid group, it may well be a drug support group, because people find themselves in terrible situations very often because of the breakdown of the family, or because of changes that they simply haven't been able to manage. And we also need to recognise that the food bank, the Trussell Trust, will give provision, a food package, for 3 days only. It's not the soup kitchen that the honourable member for Manchester Gordon talked about. They rightly limit it because they don't want to create that culture of dependency. It's about bringing those people back into the state support system, onto the charitable group that need to be addressing them. And finally, the right, I will give way in a moment. In terms of the limitations on the provision that are rightly in place, is that there are only three. I will give way in a moment. I will give way in a moment. In terms of the limitations that are in place, that are rightly there for the very good reason, is that only 3 parcels can be distributed. Only 3 parcels can be distributed.
Order. I fear the honourable gentleman is not giving way. He has the floor. Mr. Kelly.
Parcels can be distributed within a 6-month period. And if the suggestion from the right honourable member for Manchester Gorton was right, where he talked of soup kitchens, the limitations wouldn't be on that basis, because our focus must absolutely be, our focus has to be about getting those people the right level of support from the right place. Now, that may well be from their Member of Parliament, it may well be from a charitable organisation, or it may well be from the local authority or from a state sector. And I would ask those... I will give way.
The honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he recognise that food banks or soup kitchens are symptoms of something structural, as a member from Birkenhead mentioned? What is happening, what happened from 1971 to 2011 was, while productivity rose 80%, workers only shared 10% of that. Income changed from labour to capital. And Paul Krugman, the economist, has said, if this had not happened, workers would be better off by 30–40%. There's a fundamental structural shift in society that's causing these ills we're seeing at the moment.
You've never mentioned steel.
Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable member is making a powerful point, but with the regretful limit of 4 minutes contributions, I certainly can't address the structural economic debate within that period. But I would ask those who are responsible for food banks, and those that play an exceptionally important part that we need to recognise, I would ask them to refer their information to their Member of Parliament in the hope for 2 issues. One, that we may well be able to intervene if it is a benefit delay. We can help in some cases. And secondly, it is important information for us to try to influence policy. But when policy is being debated and discussed in the way that many members on the opposite bench have pursued it, it has undermined the credibility of those strong arguments that need addressing. Now, we may be in a positive position to be able to intervene in those cases, but I'm sorry that, that the debate has progressed in the way that it has. The issue must be, the background has to be the longer-term economic decline. Thankfully, today's unemployment data shows we are turning the corner. That will make a significant difference, and those who are pointing the finger the most need to recognise that that decline has taken over many years.
Ashworth. Mr. Speaker, I only want to speak briefly, but the honourable member from Glamorgan talked about the tone of this debate. Well, if I may say so, many of my constituents will be disappointed that the Minister of State, now back in her place, showed absolutely no contrition whatsoever for the acceleration of food banks on this government's watch. And the issue before us is not whether food banks existed 4 or 5 years ago. The issue before us is the sheer explosion in the number of food banks and increased demand for food banks in the last 18 months. Of course I'll give way.
The right point. I've got an excellent charity called the Irish Youth Foundation in my constituency. It's now using its capital money to set up emergency food banks, emergency aid, and provide relief for desperate young people going without food. If that's the situation, that's happened as a consequence of this government's policies.
My honourable friend makes this point with great eloquence. In my own constituency, a constituency where, far too sadly, too many of the areas of my constituency appear too highly in the various deprivation statistics, we've seen an increase in demand for the use of food banks. The Open Hands food banks in Highfields says they're doubling the food parcels they hand out. In the Saffron Lane area, they report an increase in the number of women going to those food banks. We have primary schools handing out food parcels to parents because they're too ashamed to go to the food banks on their estates. Of course I'll give way.
Hugely grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way. No one denies that there is a problem, but would the honourable gentleman not accept that this government is doing everything possible to alleviate that problem? That is why they've introduced free school meals for children in the first 3 years of primary schools. They've extended free school meals to poor students who go to FE colleges. They've frozen the council tax, frozen fuel duty, trying to cut energy bills, linking the basic state pension with earnings. Is this not real examples of how the government is helping with the cost of living?
Debate in this House, but he has to recognise that there is a huge cost of living crisis going on because of the downward pressure on wages, and increasingly people in work are going to food banks, but increasingly people on benefits are turning up these food banks because of a series of social security cuts that this department is implementing. The food banks in my constituency report increased usage because of the bedroom tax, not just for food parcels, but for those food banks that also provide furniture, because they've had to move into private rented accommodation and they haven't got the appropriate furniture, so they're going to food banks to provide furniture. They report increased usage because of the sanctions, because of the delays in appeals, because of the delays in benefit decisions. People on ESA in my constituency, because the Atos Centre isn't suitable for disabled access, either have to go to Nottingham or Birmingham for their assessment, which they can't afford to do, so they end up going without the ESA that they deserve and turning up at the food banks in my constituency. This is a sad indictment of the condition of Britain under this Tory government, Mr. Speaker.
I thank my honourable friend for very kindly giving way. He's been very kind. Does he share my concern that figures released this week show that there's been an increase in diseases like scurvy, rickets, malnourishment, and in the context of today's debate that the government should be acknowledging this, and it's frankly disgraceful that we haven't had a minister from either of the main departments sat here for the whole of this debate.
My honourable friend makes a powerful point, and it's worth repeating, an increase in those types of diseases in 21st century Britain, Mr. Speaker, under this Tory government. I'm not going to give way again. I'm sorry to the honourable gentleman, I'm not going to give way again. But of course it's not just the food banks. I represent a tremendously diverse constituency. I'm proud of that. Our Gurdwaras hand out food. They all report increased uptake in the number of non-Sikh people going to those Gurdwaras on a daily basis for the food that they hand out. Our Muslim organisations, our mosques are collecting food, which is to be handed out in our food banks. And for the honourable members opposite to say that it's all just some continuation of some statistical trend that has been going on for the last few years suggests that they are all completely in denial. Now, the Minister of State, who's now shaking her head, the Minister of State boasted that this government has commissioned a study and a review. Well, I hope that the Minister for the Voluntary Sector, and it speaks volumes, by the way, Mr Speaker, that it's the Voluntary Sector Minister who will be responding to this debate, and not a Defra Minister, but I hope the Voluntary Sector Minister, when he responds, undertakes to produce that study so both sides of the House can study it. And I hope he will also tell us, and I'm sure the officials in the box have got the statistics, whether the government, in their considered view, thinks the demand for food banks will increase or decrease in 2014 and 2015. It'll be an interesting statistic, and I look forward to the Minister outlining that in his summing up. But, Mr Speaker, what we are seeing is a whole series of changes to the way social security works by the Secretary of State, who kind of stumbles around Whitehall all the time with a kind of bleeding hole in his foot and a smoking gun in his hand. There's all these different sort of reforms, collapse with the universal credit and so on. We're seeing a whole series of changes, Mr Speaker, which are affecting our constituents, which are driving the increased demand in these food banks in our constituencies. And for the government to not acknowledge it suggests they are completely out of touch and completely in denial.
Mr James Morris.
The Black Country Food Bank in my constituency is a faith-based organisation which serves the whole of the Black Country area of the West Midlands and is run by an incredibly dedicated range of staff and volunteers. And having volunteered there myself, I know the very focused way in which they approach the way that they serve people who come to their doors. As other honourable members have pointed out, they offer 3 days of emergency help, which means that the service that they are providing at the Black Country Food Bank is not a replacement for welfare, but is integrated within the welfare system itself. And they only give food to people, I won't give way, only give, because I know that a lot of other honourable members on this side want to take part. They only give food to people who have been referred to the Black Country Food Bank by an approved agency, including social services. And when I volunteered at the Black Country Food Bank, I met people who had come to the food bank because they were suffering from very serious mental health problems, which had been identified, and they'd been referred to the food bank accordingly. Women who had been victims of domestic violence, and had been abruptly removed or wanted to be abruptly removed from their homes. Victims of family breakdown. Every single person that I met at the Black Country Food Bank came there with a unique set of circumstances, and they had been referred there as a result of a particularly unique set of circumstances. So the Black Country Food Bank plays a vital and important role in poverty fighting in my constituency. And it is true that usage of that food bank has increased. Now, that is partly due to an increased awareness of what the Black Country Food Bank does. It's inevitable that when people get to know that the Black Country Food Bank is providing a vital resource, and it's linked in with other agencies within the welfare system, that people will start to use it more. Because there's also better links being created between the food banks and local agencies. As I was saying, the local health services are aware that where people have serious mental health issues, that the food bank is on hand in order to help them. And so it's not surprising that usage of the Black Country Food Bank has gone up, because people are more aware of the vital service that is provided there. Of course.
He's paying handsome tribute to the Black Country Food Bank. Would he join me in paying tribute to his own food bank and many others, like mine in Gloucester, run by the excellent Annalise Sterry and her volunteers, who do a fantastic service for so many people, and like my office, to actually give out the vouchers? We appreciate the help that they're giving.
Makes a very good point about the valuable work that's done in his constituency. And I was saying that the Black Country Food Bank also does other vital work in the local community. As other honourable members have pointed out, they help families learn how to prepare cost-effective and nutritious meals as part of the service that they offer. And this type of course and information can have a greater impact in the medium term than the 3-day supply of food that they initially provide for people who are referred. And also, like other poverty-fighting organisations in my constituency, like the Hope Centre and the charity Loaves and Fishes, the Black Country Food Bank also provides vital work experience and apprenticeship opportunities for many people in my constituency, particularly for people who are in long-term unemployment. And again, this is linked to the job centres and linked to the whole of the welfare system. They provide very valuable skills and work, not just on a volunteer basis, but in terms of real work experience and apprenticeship opportunities which are helping the local economy. So the food bank is not just providing essential food support, it's providing a whole set of community facilities and community skills which are vital to my local area. And I would agree with other honourable members who have said that to try and make political capital out of groups and a political battle out of groups like the Black Country Food Bank in my constituency and the work that they do in my community is very, very disappointing. Those who run the food banks, like the Black Country Food Bank, deserve our respect. They deserve our support for the committed and dedicated work they do for some of the most vulnerable members of my community.
Stephen Twigg.
There is no desire on this side of the House to make political capital out of those who've set up food banks or those who use food banks. What we are doing is representing our constituents. In my case, there has been an exponential growth in the use of food banks since 2010 in my constituency, and what I and others on this side of the House are doing is giving voice to those constituents. And I think it's disgraceful for the honourable gentleman to stand up and suggest that somehow we're trying to make political capital out of this. I listened really carefully earlier on, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of State, and I think what we heard from her was a striking combination of denial and complacency. Both the tone and the substance of what she said to the House today failed to meet the scale of the challenge that is faced in communities up and down the country. And it's simply not acceptable for her to sit there shaking her head when she knows the damage that this is causing to communities up and down this country. Of course I give way.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Does he agree with me that if members on the other side were genuinely appreciative of the work that food banks do, they would not have turned down £2.5 billion of EU funding to subsidise food banks?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to draw the House's attention to that. What I want to do this afternoon is to draw attention to some of the fantastic things that are happening in Liverpool to address the crisis of food poverty. Someone earlier in the debate said food banks demonstrate both the good and the bad in our modern society. And I want to thank all of the volunteers that have made a success of food banks in my constituency. To refer to the North Liverpool Food Bank, which has 90 volunteers. They see around 150 people a week. They opened 2 years ago in November 2011. They now have 8 separate distribution centres in North Liverpool, including in my constituency in Croxteth and Norris Green. Norris Green is the council ward in Liverpool that has the largest number of households directly affected by the bedroom tax. Over 1,000 households in that one ward in my constituency are affected by the bedroom tax, and the food bank tell me that one of the reasons for the increased uptake of the food bank there is precisely because of this government's introduction of the bedroom tax. Secondly, the Dovecot Food Bank, which was set up by Labour councillors in the Dovecot area of my constituency, providing crucial support. Thirdly, the Next Steps project, to which my honourable friend, the member for Knowsley, referred earlier on, set up by Councillor Peter Mitchell from my constituency. Next Steps both provides food banks, but also provides support for people to get back into work. And Peter told me earlier today of a wonderful example of a 58-year-old man who used the programme being run there to find a job after a long period of unemployment, and he was so happy at the support that he'd had that he burst into tears when he got that news. In December of this month alone, that food bank will feed 1,000 people, and they expect to have fed 7,000 people this year. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to refer to a brilliant initiative by Joe Anderson, the Mayor of Liverpool. Joe has set up with Tesco the Mayor's Hope Fund, which is to launch an innovative project to aid the relief of poverty in Liverpool. And basically, when you go to Tesco, you can make a donation to support the running of the food banks across Liverpool. A practical example of a Labour local government leader working with the private sector to deliver to support the food banks. I'd like to finish by appealing to whichever minister we're going to hear from at the end of this debate to listen to what my right honourable friend said in opening this debate. I thank my honourable
friend for giving way before he finishes his speech. But does he agree with me that it is an absolute disgrace that we have to have food banks and those sorts of initiatives in the 6th richest country in the world?
Absolutely. And what my constituents say to me, those that don't have to use the food banks look in disbelief when they learn about the scale of the increase in the use of food banks in recent years. So I absolutely concur with my honourable friend, and I appeal to the government to publish the DEFRA report. That seems to me to be, I won't take further intervention, to publish the DEFRA report, but also to do what my right honourable friend from Birkenhead said that the government should do, which is to have a proper inquiry into the causes of the growth of food banks, so that in future we can see not a further exponential growth as we've seen over the last 3.5 years, but a decline in the use of food banks, which is surely something that we could all support.
Mr. Robert Sims.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Poor Food Bank do a valuable job and are supported by a wide range of people, largely by the churches, but from people across the political spectrum. And I think they're dealing with what must be a very difficult personal crisis for many people when they want to try and put food on the table. As a parent, one can't conceive of a situation where you worry about what to provide for your children that evening. And I think it is, in some respects, a perfect example of third sector doing what they can to plug a particular gap in a particularly difficult time. But if we wind ourselves back to where this sort of started, I was sitting on the other side of the chamber watching the budgets, the economic management of this country. At that stage I was told that boom and bust had been abolished, and yet we had one of the biggest busts, nearly 7% of GDP. And however you cut it, however you look at it, if GDP falls by that much, living standards are going to take a hit. And I will in a moment. And I would make this important point, is that it could have been a lot worse had people in work gone for high pay increases to compensate for some of the high bills coming in. But they didn't do that. They priced themselves into jobs. And it could have been worse if people had been irresponsible, but they haven't. And it is a miracle that this country, given the scale of the bust, only has 7.4% of people unemployed. When you look at Europe, you see the Germans lower, the Dutch lower, but actually Britain isn't doing too badly. I will give way.
Very briefly, I'm grateful to my honourable friend from Paul. Does my honourable friend agree that whilst we all should be supporting the churches, charities and organisations like the West Northumberland Food Bank in my constituency, it is the Salvation Army that we should be particularly praising, who have been providing food assistance for generations in this country?
That's a very good point. Essentially, we all know that many people in work, as well as those out of work, have taken a big drop in their living standards. We know that's because, we know that's because of the economic crisis. But the really good thing is that we still have a lot of people in work and we have a growing economy. And it's inevitable, as we grow forward, that living standards will start to recover as incomes go up, as the market recovers, and as we actually start to export more. I will give way the honourable.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for giving way. I'm afraid his description of the macroeconomic picture is not as connected to the microeconomic picture as he might assume. Volunteers at the food bank in my constituency tell me that they hear that the cause is people moving from benefit into work. The benefit stops, but the paycheck is at the end of the month too far away. I'm afraid economic recovery won't reach all parts unless we make it do so. So will he say what we can do to make sure that happens?
what we have to understand is one of the reasons we're bringing in universal credit is to make the transition from employment into work a lot easier. But it's a complicated scheme, we all know that, but it's, I think, a very worthwhile venture, because anything that makes it easier to create employment is meant to be a good thing.
On that point, will my friend agree?
I won't, because I've got a limited amount of time. I've already taken 2 interventions. So I think, certainly as the economy recovers, living standards will recover, but there's a short-term problem, a long-term problem. The short-term problem is purely the recession and recovering from that, which we all know is going to take several years. The long-term problem with globalisation is that in the West we've seen those that benefit from that, particularly at the high-income scale, particularly people in financial services, have had and can manage very high rewards. But many people in ordinary jobs haven't managed over a period of time to increase their living standards. That's a feature of the US economy. It may be a feature of our economy, which is why the government are looking at apprenticeships. It's why the government are trying to put a far more robust, resilient system into the education system. The stats we had the other day from the OECD about English, about maths, about skilling our workforce is actually a very important way of ensuring that they can generate income and they can generate higher living standards. I think the government has the right instincts and the right answers. It just is going to take a long time to sort the problem out. I will be, yes.
He's made a very important point by just saying to him that if the money supply is allowed to triple in 13 years while they were in power, we shouldn't be surprised if those nearest the source of the new money got rich while everybody else went backwards.
Well, there is an argument about what impact that has, and it does actually help people with assets rather than those without assets. But nevertheless, I actually think progress is being made. I think the figures this morning on unemployment, I think, are a good staging post on the way. We do have to do a lot more to educate, to skill our workforce so that we can compete in the global race. And if we do that, then I think we can get living standards up for all people. It is a fact of life, and if you study all the stats, that some of the more equal societies in Scandinavia are happier societies. And what any government has to do in this country is to ensure that as the economy recovers, all sections of the community actually can earn a living and enjoy an increase in living standards.
The Honourable Gentleman's finished. We're grateful. Dayman Beg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At the moment, Aberdeen is doing well. Despite the recession, the economy in Aberdeen is booming. There's so much activity in the North Sea oil and gas sector that we are presently experiencing a labour shortage. Unemployment in my constituency on today's figures is down to 1.5%, which comes pretty close to being full employment. But despite all this, there is something else which is booming, and that's the use and the growth of food banks. I heard the Secretary of State said this morning that the rise in food banks is because decent people want to help people who may be in some temporary difficulty. But I don't think so. Like the Honourable Member for Birkenhead, I think there is something more fundamental going on here. I'll give way to my colleague from the Select Committee.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Does she agree with me that it's a real worry that the demand for food bank use seems to be related to the targets around social security sanctions? That's certainly the experience in my food bank in Oldham, and one constituent has waited for an appeal around a sanction for 4 months without any money. For him, the food bank has been a lifeline.
Been lobbied by a number of organisations saying that indeed it is the failures in the benefit system that's causing much of this increase. Because if the use of food banks was just some passing phase born out of the global banking crisis and the recent years of austerity, then we wouldn't be seeing the growth in places like Aberdeen. And if the use of food banks is temporary, then why, when the government says the economy is picking up, is their use still growing? And if the use of food banks is nothing new, why are we seeing more families depending on food parcels than at any time in history? Food banks are growing. If you don't mind, I'll let somebody else in if I get through this quickly. Food banks are growing, both in the numbers of organisations which are operating food banks and the number of food parcels which are distributed each week. Before 2010, there were people who required food parcels, but their numbers were tiny, and it was a short stopgap measure to get them over an immediate crisis. However, in the first 6 months of this financial year, 27 tonnes of food were distributed across Aberdeen by just 4 of the organisations operating food banks, and that figure doesn't include the Trussell Trust. Something must have changed between the financial crash and today. Well, the one thing that has changed is the government. And another thing which has changed is the government's reforms to social security, and the attitude to the government to those in welfare has changed too. So even in relatively affluent areas like Aberdeen, we are seeing families dependent on food parcels to eat. And many organisations point to failures in the benefit system as the primary cause of the increase in the use of food banks. Oxfam and the Church Action on Poverty thought the situation serious enough they encouraged their supporters to lobby their MP, to lobby the Work and Pension Select Committee to look into the link between the increase in the use of food banks and the increase in the use of sanctions, as well as the increase in long delays and mistakes in benefit payments by Job Centre Plus. And a large number of MPs from both sides of the House, and that might explain the very large attendance today, they passed their constituent concerns to us. And the belief that much of the problem is caused by errors in benefit payments is shared by Citizen Advice Scotland, who report that 73% of the people using food banks cite problems with their welfare payments. 30% are due to delays in getting the payment to which they are entitled, and 22% because of job seeker allowance sanctions. However, the people who have been sanctioned make up a less than a quarter of those who are using food banks, because all too commonly it's because people have fallen in hard times through no fault of their own. People are still falling ill and losing their jobs as a result, only to face a long delay in getting any benefit. These delays have got worse in recent years, and it seems to be taking longer and longer to get benefits reinstated once they've been stopped, even by accident. Our cuts to the benefits people used to get, including the most pernicious of all, the bedroom tax. And all of this is before the largest change of all, universal credit, has been introduced. So things could get worse. We should be breaking the dependency, not making it worse. The government needs to recognise the increase of the food banks isn't some accident. It isn't just because of the economic downturn. It isn't just because they are there. It's because of the policies being actively pursued by the government. And the use of food banks won't drop until the government realises this and does something to make those who have fallen in hard times are able to feed themselves and not have to rely on charity.
The Honourable Lady finished. Thank you. John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great privilege to contribute to this debate. I have the privilege and honour of representing the HQ of Trussell Trust in Salisbury, and the Trussell Trust food banks were established in my constituency over 15 years ago. And it started in 2000 when a charity called the Trussell Trust, who at that time were working in Bulgaria to look after street children who were 60 street children who were asleep at the railway stations in Bulgaria. The founder of the charity received a call from a desperate mother in Salisbury who said, "My children are going to bed hungry tonight. What are you going to do about it?" That was in 2000, and in 2004 2 food banks were set up. And the people of Salisbury support the Trussell Trust Food Bank very generously all year round. And yes, there are people in Salisbury with 1.6% unemployment that use the food bank. And I want to pay tribute to those individuals who I've got to know over the last 3.5 years from Salisbury who lead the work of the Trussell Trust.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Certainly.
I'm hugely grateful to my honourable friend, and he speaks very powerful. The spirit that he mentions about the food bank that was set up by the Trussell Trust has extended itself to Harlow, with the Harlow Food Bank set up originally by the Michael Roberts Charitable Trust, but linked to the Trussell Trust, and they do extraordinary amount of work, and it has actually become a very important part of our community. Will he celebrate that and also does he not agree that this is something that we should support and not try to use as a political attack?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend's intervention, and of course I think we all support the work of the food banks, and we support those individuals who work in them. I do want to just finish my tribute to Chris Mould, David McCauley, Molly Hudson and Mark Elling, who I've got to know, and their responsibility has really been to drive out the growth of food banks. And that may be uncomfortable for some of us on this side, and the implications of that and the way that the debates, perhaps the tone of the debate has taken a turn, unfortunately, this afternoon. But I do want to, just one moment, I'll make a bit of progress and I'll come back to you in a minute. But I do think we've got to acknowledge that there have been two phases of growth in food banks. In 2005-06, there were fewer than 3,000 users. By 2009-10, they were 40,000. And we've seen a similar scale, I accept, of use. The question is, why? And what are we going to do about it? Well, a factor of 10 to around 500,000 users at the moment. So I'm not trying to deny the scale of the use of the food banks. If honourable members opposite would stop perhaps trying to make political points, I'm trying to make a deeper point. The issue that strikes me as so important is getting to the bottom of why so many people are using the food banks. And the Trussell Trust themselves say that it's about homelessness, benefit delay, low income, changes to the benefits, but they also say it's about domestic violence, sickness, refused short-term benefit advance, debt and unemployment.
A member of the public in my constituency has had to go through our Trussell Trust because she was a victim of domestic violence, and she was separated and she had nowhere to go and her husband wasn't prepared to fund anything at all. But could I also pay tribute, which you've been doing, or my honourable member's been doing, on the Trussell Trust, because Hope for Belper have been supporting it, as well as the local paper, the Belper News, to increase the amount of food given by volunteers to the Trussell Trust in Derby, in Belper, in order to spread the amount of food that they can give out to people requiring it.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend's intervention. I think it speaks for itself. But on the deeper causes, it seems to me that it's not a question of isolating one particular change. And I recognise that it's acknowledged by the Trussell Trust from the data that they've collected that the changes in the benefits have presented significant challenges. But what I find lacking in this debate is a serious estimation of what alternative measures could be put in place other than remove the sanctions regime, give more money. Where is that money going to come from? How will the incentive effect of... I'm going to carry on, actually. How will the incentive effect of the benefit changes that this government so desperately wants to bring in going to have a chance of success unless we make these changes and deal carefully and deliberately? And some of the benefit changes have taken a long time to come through, to actually let them take effect and deliver the deeper change that needs to occur. Because the reality is, too, that underneath all the motivations for people going to the Trussell Trust and other food banks across the country is a whole number of issues, leading to a chaotic situation where people find them in a great state of debt, do not have the financial management skills sometimes to know how to prioritise spending. Now, I'm not saying this in every case, but I think we've got to be honest about the breadth of the problems that the individuals that use the food banks face and come up with a solution that addresses all of that, not try and tritely simplify it into it's all about the benefit changes and the government needs to do something, but by the way, I'm not going to say specifically what we would do as an alternative, how much it would cost and how we're going to pay for it in what time scale. Because unless that argument and those alternative policies are advanced, it does ring very shallow for everyone involved in food banks. The final thing I would like to say is that I do think it is regrettable that the relationship between the Trussell Trust and the DWP has broken down to some degree. And I hope that that dialogue can reopen and we can see some progress. I don't believe that any honourable member in this House is happy to see people going hungry in their constituency. But I do ask that we should be honest and holistic in our view of what needs to be done to sort it out.
Mr. Roger Godsiff.
Mr. Speaker, I was one of the lucky generation who was brought up in a country with a social market economy
run by governments, both Labour and Conservative, which believed that the state had a duty to provide a safety net for its citizens, not to abandon them to the instabilities of unregulated markets. There was a post-war consensus of politicians, including many One Nation Conservatives, people like Macmillan, Butler, McLeod and others, who rejected what Ted Heath, as PM, called the unacceptable face of capitalism. The images of mass unemployment, soup kitchens, repercussions of the 1929 stock market crash were to be banished forever. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I never believed for one moment that 50 years later I would be participating in a debate in this House, living in a country with the 7th largest economy in the world, discussing why 41,000 people in the West Midlands and countless others throughout the country are having to rely on modern-day soup kitchens, food banks, in order to feed themselves and their families. I give way.
I'm very grateful, honourable gentleman, for the opportunity to support his point, because he's probably aware that the gap between the richest 1% in the United States of America is now the largest since the 1920s, the very decade he's mentioned. And the incomes of the top 1% have gone up by 20%, while the incomes of the 99% have only gone up by 1%. It's those tectonic plates are changing.
I thank the honourable member for those comments, and I'm aware of them. Mr. Speaker, in my constituency is the Sparkhill Food Bank, which feeds hundreds of people every week. And I would like to share with this House the comments of somebody who's used that food bank. She's a young lady who lives in the Moseley area of my constituency, and she says, "This time last year I was working full-time in a well-paid job, but lost my job. I found temporary work. That ended in February this year. I also suffered bereavements and the breakdown of my long-term relationship and ended up in receipt of benefits. I got into debt with all my utility bills, and most of my job seekers' allowance was used to pay Empower and Severn Trent Water." I will.
Thank you. Can I thank my honourable friend for giving way? I've been told by the food banks in Widnes and Runcorn in my constituency that they're seeing an increasing number of people without gas or electricity, and therefore the food they can supply to them is inappropriate. They're now having to look at what type of food they give to their clients. So it's not actually a matter of what food is denoted, it's what food people can actually have and use.
I hear exactly what my honourable friend says. Mr. Speaker, she goes on to say, "At my lowest, I was living off £5 a fortnight. I eventually sought help and was referred to fantastic local charities who helped me deal with my debts and in turn referred me to the Sparkhill Food Bank. I will never forget going to the food bank. It was a humbling experience and I spent 40 minutes crying as I was so ashamed. But the workers at the food bank were fantastic and put me at ease, while assuring me that my circumstances were not my fault and in no way a reflection of me as a human being." She says, "Luckily my circumstances are going to change for the better very soon, as I've recently found a job. But I will never forget the kindness of strangers who helped me fill my belly in England in 2013. Mr. Speaker, the government ought to be ashamed of presiding over a situation where people like this have to go through what this young lady, who is not feckless, who is not a shirker, has had to go through. And I say this to the government. At the end of the day, lives are going to be scarred by the humiliation of forcing people into food banks, and not just individuals, but their children as well. And whatever the government says, and the MPs on the other side of the House, you should be ashamed of that.
Mr. Neil Carmichael.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a great pleasure to speak in this debate. It's a really important subject. And first of all, what I want to do is pay tribute to my own Stroud Food Bank, which is excellent example of exactly what should be delivered for those who are desperately in need. They are a fantastic organisation, and they are effectively they demonstrate precisely what we need to do. They are operating in circumstances which are difficult. They've moved from a difficult landlord in London Road to a new landlord elsewhere, and I think they will launch themselves yet again as a tribute to what is needed. But the real issue here is this. What we need to do is make sure that people actually have the opportunity to have a fulfilled life, and that actually is through work, that actually is through contributing to their own selves. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm very grateful, because the honourable member represents a region which has a lot of rural areas in it. Does he join me in paying tribute to the special work that trusts do, and independent trusts that help with food banks? Because food poverty and fuel poverty is a lot higher in rural areas, so their job is made even more difficult.
Absolutely, fuel poverty is an issue, and I fully accept that. But what is the greatest issue, I think, is the need for people to recognise that there are opportunities in the workforce, there are opportunities to seek employment, there are opportunities to actually fulfil their lives, and that is where we need to go.
Would the honourable gentleman give
I thank the member for giving way, and of course finding a job should be the way out of poverty, and isn't that why it is so shocking that the majority of working age people living below the poverty line are now in working households, and 2/3 of all children living in poverty are living in working families? What should his government be doing about that?
What the government is actually doing is making sure that more people are actually at work. And we've already discovered today just how that policy is working. And the real opportunity that we have to give all people, including young people, is the ability to actually engage in a working life. Yes?
I'm very grateful he's being very generous. Isn't there quite a lot that we can do as MPs? My volunteer team work alongside the food bank volunteer team to make sure that food bank clients are getting all the help that is available for them to get themselves out of poverty and their families and improve their lives.
I think my honourable friend makes a really excellent point. It's about the holistic approach to helping people. And I recognise that certain individuals do get into situations which they really need emergency help. And I'm really grateful to Stroud's Food Bank for providing that. But I also think it's important to make sure that they are pointed in the right direction to make overall decisions which will benefit themselves and their families, because that's what matters to them, and that's the key issue. So I will finish by pointing out this observation. It is critical that we recognise the economic value of supporting people into work.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Food banks have become the shameful symbol of Britain under a Tory government. They have turned us into a country where, despite being one of the richest in the world, rapidly rising numbers of British people, many of them in work, are forced to turn to charity to feed themselves and their families. And this government has the affront, and we've heard it from the Minister already, to say that all is well, when for most people things are getting harder and not easier. As my honourable friend, the member for Birkenhead, has said, the government just won't admit that they are part of the problem. And ministers are sitting on the independent report that they commissioned, presumably because they are ashamed and embarrassed by what it tells them. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Trussell Trust say that 1 in 3 of those fed by food banks are children. My honourable friend for the member for Leicester South made that point. Many are disabled, including those hit by the cruel, callous and unworkable bedroom tax, something my honourable friend, the member for Liverpool West Derby, spoke about. Many are in work but earning less than the living wage. Indeed, the majority of people in poverty today are in work, as my honourable friends, the members for Torvan and Aberdeen South mentioned. I will give way.
I wonder if the Right Honourable Lady is aware that the Citizens Advice Bureaus in Scotland published some research earlier this week suggesting that the main drivers for the increase in use of food banks was in fact aspects related to the benefit system, particularly the increase in use of sanctions, but also delays and administrative errors.
Sanctions, delays, the bedroom tax are all contributing to that increased number of people who are turning to food banks. And today we have heard from honourable members the powerful human stories behind the statistics. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I compared the festive periods at the food banks in my own constituency. In Cardiff, seen a doubling in the last 2 years in the festive period, and in Penarth, an 8 times increase on the festive period last year. Isn't the real tragedy here that this is actually also particularly a Christmas crisis of food banks?
Yes, and whilst my honourable friend refers to the festive period, for many it will not be festive at all. Mr Deputy Speaker, in my own constituency, a young woman I met a fortnight ago with an 18-month daughter came to see me. The woman had left her ex-husband to escape domestic violence. She was worried sick because the Benefits Office had cut her off when her ex-husband forcibly claimed to have custody of her child. She has been waiting for weeks without any support at all, while they fail to rectify the mistake. Without the food banks in my constituency, run by St George's Crypt, St Bartholomew's Church in Armley and by the Trussell Trust, that woman and her daughter would have gone without food. She has been let down, badly let down, by this government and by the delays and sanctions that they bring. I will give way.
Can I tell my honourable friend that the food banks in my constituency, which currently number at least 6, tell me that people are without food for 3 months before they turn up at the food bank and ask for help? Isn't that an indictment on that party officer?
I think that's a really important point to make, because some members on the other side and some ministers suggest that people go to food banks because the food is free. The Minister for Welfare Reform says that there's almost an infinite demand for such a thing. But as my honourable friend has pointed out, people have real pride and are ashamed to go to food banks. As my honourable friend for Newport East said, these are sad stories and real lives. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
Firstly, I would like to see a government inquiry into the issue of food poverty. But can the honourable lady tell me whether she believes that unmet need for emergency food relief is currently increasing or decreasing?
Well, the number of people going to food banks is increasing. The demand is there because they're not getting the support they need from the welfare state. The Red Cross, Food Cycle, the Trussell Trust are all saying the same. And it would be useful if the government were to publish the report that they commissioned into the growing use of food banks. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, what is the response of government to this crisis? Well, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and it's nice to see him here, said on the radio this morning that there has been a growth in food banks. As they grow, people attend them. In the world of the Secretary of State, the rise in food bank use to 500,000 people reflects an increase in supply, even though that we know that you need to be referred to go to a food bank. You can't just turn up. Mr Speaker, the logic of this government... Mr Deputy Speaker, the logic of this government is like blaming the number of house fires on the number of fire engines. I say shame on the Secretary of State and shame on this government. And you have to ask, Mr Deputy Speaker, how many children will have to go hungry this Christmas before the government takes action? Before the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs and the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions acknowledge that there is a problem and then finally do something about it. Mr Deputy Speaker, the charities, churches, community groups and volunteers who run the food banks show us Britain at its best. A country of generosity and of solidarity. One nation pulling together, to do what they can for the least fortunate among us. We should and we do applaud them. As so many honourable members have said in the contributions to the debate this afternoon, particularly my honourable friends, the members for Copeland and for Newport East, and most recently in his intervention, my honourable friend for Birmingham Hall Green, when he spoke about the kindness of strangers. But, Mr Deputy Speaker, when the Prime Minister promised us the big society, is this really what he had in mind? Homelessness rising, a boom in payday lending, more and more lives scarred by long-term unemployment, and 500,000 people relying on food banks to feed themselves and their families. Mr Deputy Speaker, it's downright Dickensian. A tale of two nations, tax cuts for the rich and food banks for the poor. As my honourable friend, the member for Manchester Gorton, said, as we in this chamber look forward to Christmas, we must spare a thought for those who are not going to have any sort of Christmas at all. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
To my honourable friend, but do you not agree with me that it is a basic human right to have enough food so you do not go hungry, and you should not have to rely on charity in this country?
My honourable friend makes an incredibly important point, because while we all applaud and thank the food banks and the volunteers and the people who donate food for everything they do, that's not the way in which our basic needs should be met. The basic need for food should be met through wages and a social safety net when it's needed. The basic need for housing should be met by our wages or by the social safety net when it's needed. The basic need to be able to heat your home and turn on the lights should be met by having a decent wage or a social safety net when it's needed.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. Has she seen, as I have, the study of the Children's Society, that under this government the real value of the adult national minimum wage is 50 pence an hour less than it was when Labour was in office? Isn't this low pay crisis one of the key drivers of the explosion in the use of food banks?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and the national minimum wage was one of the proudest achievements of the last Labour government. It lifted millions of people out of poverty pay, the majority of them women, and employment increased while the members opposite said it would decrease, the unemployment would increase as a result of it. But we also know today that the real value of the national minimum wage has not kept pace with average earnings and has not kept pace with the rising costs of energy, of food prices and everything else. And so increasingly, people who are in work are having to turn to food banks to be able to make ends meet. And whilst we welcomed the unemployment numbers today, we also saw that a record number of people are working part-time who want to work full-time. And we know also that for 41 of the 42 months whilst this Prime Minister has been in office, prices have risen at a faster rate than earnings. And so for all those reasons, my honourable friend is right to point to the problems of the minimum wage, a minimum wage which has not kept pace with the rising cost of living, and a minimum wage that is not even being enforced. And with more than 5 million people being paid less than a living wage, we know that we need to redouble our efforts to ensure that more people can support themselves and their families rather than having to turn to food aid. Mr Deputy Speaker, 70 years ago, William Beveridge spoke of the 5 giants that he said a civilised country must overcome: squalor, ignorance, want, idleness and disease. Under this Tory-led government, those giants are rearing their ugly heads again. We need a Labour government to slay them.
Minister for the Cabinet Office to reply to the debate, Mr Nick Hurd.
The Honourable Lady for Newport West talked about sad stories in real lives, and she was right. And that is why the House is so packed, because of our concern on both sides of the House about what is going on here. A number of contributors to the debate have talked in tones of regret about its tone. And they have a point. So let me start, as the Minister for Civil Society, by joining those many colleagues on both sides of the House, but particularly the member for Gloucester, the member for Hollowson and Rowley Regis, the member for Brecon and Reddenshire, the member for Liverpool and West Derby, the member for Harlow, the member for Birmingham Hall Green, the member for Stroud, who went out of their way to thank the people who set up food banks, who volunteer food banks and who donate to them in their constituencies. It is, frankly, Mr. Speaker, I will not give way at the moment, it is, frankly, Mr. Speaker, an enormously impressive human civil society response to need. Need that is not new, need that has perhaps been under-recognised by governments of all colours, but a response that is entirely resonant with the very proud traditions of the voluntary sector and the churches in this country. It's entirely right that we should start this response by congratulating them. And I give way to the Honourable Member for Gravesend.
Mr. Speaker, some years ago I spent 5 months living homeless in London amongst the dispossessed and the mentally ill. Does the Minister agree with me that for those people, for a television programme, for those... Do it yourself, try it. Would the Minister agree with me that for people living very chaotic lifestyles, actually food banks can be enormously helpful? It's true.
Food banks are enormously helpful. It's not entirely clear from the debate whether the Labour Party are for them or against them, which is why I wanted to place on record our recognition on this side of the House for the enormously valuable work that they do. And it was quite right that the Member of Parliament for Salisbury had the opportunity to place on record his admiration for the work of the Trussell Trust, founded in his constituency. The Honourable Member for Wickham spoke, I must say, very powerfully indeed through his own personal family experience and mentioned the community store. I'd like to pay tribute to Fair Share, a national charity that feeds more than 51,000 people every day. And they do that, Mr. Speaker, through a unique and amazing partnership with the food industry that have not been recognised in the debate, but actually the strides made by Sainsbury's, Tesco, as their other big retail partners and organisations like Nestle and Gerber make what Fair Share do possible, and they should be congratulated. I should also say that the government is actively supporting these organisations. Quite clear.
The Minister's not giving way at the moment.
But through the Cabinet Office, I'm extremely proud that through our Social Action Fund, Mr. Speaker, we've granted £1.7 million to Tier Fund that runs programmes in partnership with the Cinnamon Network that aim to tackle a variety of local issues like food banks and food poverty. And I'm proud to say that including 81 Trussell-run food bank franchises benefited from that funding. More funding is made available, more franchises are applying for it. So this government is very proud to place on record our acknowledgement and congratulations on food banks on our active programme to support them. Yes.
I'm extremely grateful to the Minister. Will he join me in congratulating those who recently helped set up a food bank in Beverley, those who've run the Holderness Food Bank from Hornsey, the church groups and others for the last 2 years, and also the Real Aid Children's Charity in Ticton outside Beverley, which does so much to help those in crisis. Those people, there will always be people in crisis. We need to make sure we have in place the measures to support them.
Yeah, I entirely agree with him, and I congratulate him on the tone that he set, which I think jars or is at odds with the tone set by the Labour front bench, who frankly I think, I'm not going to give way because I'm going to address this and we're running out of time, but many members in the debate complained about the tone which was set by the Labour front bench, Mr. Speaker, who came here to play the blame game, which turns the public off in total denial about the past, the actions of the last government to precipitate the economic crisis that underpins the demand and the need here, that came here almost pretending that there was some golden age before 2010 when the social system worked perfectly, the economy worked perfectly, and the big state in all its glory was there to help everyone in need. Absolute rubbish. Delighted to give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way.
Does the Minister accept that scrapping the National Social Fund and has made it more difficult for people to get crisis loans, which has pushed people towards food banks?
The social fund is being administered by local authorities, as the honourable gentleman well knows, as a councillor himself.
Strong order. There are strong feelings on both sides, but the Minister must be heard. Minister heard.
No, I'm sure not one penny was cut. It's been devolved to local authorities, and that's entirely the right thing to do. But there was no acknowledgement of the past, Mr. Speaker.
Order, Sir Gerald Kaufman.
That is exactly what he is.
Not a point of order, but I'm sure it has humoured the right honourable member. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was no acknowledgement of the past, no real acknowledgement of some of the complexities underlying this situation. They did come here simply to make political capital, and I think lost the respect of the House. And it would have been nice to have had some acknowledgement in the remarks from the front bench or the back bench about the improvement to the economy and the fact that we now have more than 30 million people here, were a record number, and the performance of this government in 3 years to get this economy back on track. Delighted to give way. Yeah.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I think he was somewhat churlish in not acknowledging that many people on this side of the House are also extremely grateful to those who work in food banks. But when I went to my local church-run food bank, these are people who are not political. The one thing they wanted to tell me was how shocked they were at the way that so many of the people coming to them were suffering from sanctions, not sanctions as a last resort, but sanctions as a first.
I agree with the Honourable Gentleman. These magnificent volunteers are not political, and therefore I warn the Labour Party against politicising this issue, because that is the gravest charge against, because I think they forfeited any respect out there from the sad stories in real life through the approach they took. But here we had a front bench spokesman come here to talk about problem with absolutely no indication of a solution. We've had Labour members standing up to say that the welfare system is the problem, and we have a shadow front bench spokesman who is on record saying that she will be tougher than the Tories on welfare. So what does that mean, actually, for food banks? Will there be more or less under leadership? We have no idea at all. What we have, yes, I'm delighted to give way to Member Chester.
Was my honourable friend as disappointed as I was with the opposition front bench, who in a 10-minute speech did not give one policy that the opposition would do to put this right?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say I would be shocked by that, but not anymore.
The question is that the question be now put. As many as are there have been, say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, the ayes have it. The question is as on the order paper. As many as are there have been in, say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. So the question is as on the order paper. As many as are there have been, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Tellers for the ayes, Mr David Hamilton and Mr Nick Dakin. Tellers for the noes, Anne Milton and Mr Mark Hunter.
Lock the doors! Frank. David. Oh, no, right, he's gone. Order! Order!
Steady, Tiger.
The ayes to the right, 251. The noes to the left, 294.
The ayes to the right, 251. The noes to the left, 294. The noes have it, the noes have it, and look!
The House to now adjourn.
The question is that this House to now adjourn. What have we got? Peter, right, Peter Aldis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to have secured this debate, as I believe that the coastal flooding that took place on the 5th December is a matter that should be considered on the floor of the House. The storm surge has had a devastating impact on many coastal communities. There is a strong sense in these communities that Parliament has not properly considered what was a narrowly averted national crisis. Many have seen their homes destroyed, whilst for others they have been seriously damaged and they will not be able to return home for many months. People have lost their possessions built up over a lifetime. Many small businesses, some of which have difficulty securing full insurance cover, have been seriously hit. On what was Small Business Saturday, when MPs were out promoting small businesses, that many firms in coastal communities were busy trying to salvage what was left of their livelihood. Many coastal communities face significant economic challenges, and I am concerned that such events might make it more difficult to attract the inward investment that is needed to create new jobs. Whilst Waveney and Lowestoft are the focus of what I'm going to have to say, I'm very much aware that these events have affected many communities all along the North Sea coast, and colleagues will have their own specific concerns, though hopefully I shall be able to address some of these on their behalf. I'm conscious that my colleagues, the honourable members for Great Yarmouth and North Norfolk, have been particularly active in support of communities affected in their constituencies, but are unable to participate in this debate due to their ministerial responsibilities. Mr Deputy Speaker, whilst no one lost their lives as a result of the flooding, my constituent Robert Dello died in the course of his work as a lorry driver as a result of the high winds. I offer my condolences to his family, friends and work colleagues.
Yeah.
Whilst geographically small areas were affected in Lowestoft and Alton Broad, the impact there has been dramatic. Levington Court is a complex which provides housing and care for vulnerable older people. The residents of the 19 flats on the ground floor have been evacuated. Their possessions have been destroyed, and they will not be able to return to their homes for some months. The Fife Centre provides accommodation for the homeless. 27 people have been flooded out, and likewise it will take some months to refurbish and repair the building before they can return. Other residential areas, including St John's Road and Marine Parade, have been hard hit. Many of these homes are in the rental sector, and people have seen all their possessions destroyed. Businesses have been hard hit, including Ling's Car Showroom, the East Coast Cinema, Britain's most easterly cinema, and Buyer Parcel. The traders in Bevan Street East, which runs parallel to the street where my own office is located, have been dealt a particularly savage blow. Infrastructure was damaged. The A12 from Ipswich was closed for 36 hours, and both train lines to Norwich and Ipswich were out of action. A full service on the latter has only resumed today. There was structural damage to coastal defences, and the infrastructure at the port of Lowestoft was also damaged. The doctor's surgery at Marine Parade has had to move and will probably not return from its new location. To the south at Kessingland, the coastal defences around the Anglian Water pumping station that serves that community have been badly eroded, and there is now an urgent need to produce a new flood defence scheme. Until 2 weeks ago, it was envisaged that this would not be necessary for some years. Mr Deputy Speaker, the scene is a sad one, but some good things do come out of adversity. It is important to point out that due to the investment that has been made in flood defences in the last few years, and the way that coastal flooding is now managed, many properties were protected that otherwise would have been flooded. The various statutory authorities, including the Environment Agency, the Met Office, the Police and Fire Services, the Flood Forecasting Centre,